Committee Room 21. Signed. 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 Committee Room 29. 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 Signed. Committee Room 29, 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 Sound. 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 Committee Room 29, Sound.
Okay, so just going to provide a brief overview of today's business. So the committee will receive oral evidence from the Community Transport Association on funding implications on the community transport sector. We're going to receive oral evidence from the Department for Infrastructure providing an update on its approach to transport decarbonisation. And we're going to consider 3 statutory rules and 3 proposals for statutory rules not subject to assembly procedure. Just remind everybody obviously to keep your mobile phones muted and your devices muted as well. So we're going to proceed through the agenda. Apologies, I just have one apology from John Sturt, and then we have Nicola and Mark joining online. Declarations of interest. I remind members that they are obliged to declare any relevant financial or other interests which might reasonably be thought by others to influence their approach to the matter under consideration. Any members who have interest to declare in relation to today's business should do so now when the particular matter arises in the meeting. So does any members have any interest they wish to declare? No? Okay. Chairperson's business. So there's a couple of items here. Firstly, I want to welcome the fact that yesterday the Minister launched a school bus safety campaign this is something that the committee has raised with the Minister, and we also raised with the Education Minister as well. So I'm pleased that there is a public awareness campaign that is now happening and that the Minister has launched that, because obviously road safety is a priority of this committee, and I'm pleased that the committee played a role in raising this issue with the Minister directly. So I was pleased to see that yesterday. Also, I want to welcome, yesterday there was an announcement as well from the Minister on the intention to increase funding for community transport services. Obviously we'll have Community Transport Association here in the committee today, and we can discuss that with them and what that might mean for them going forward. So it's welcome to see that announcement, because we all know how important community transport is in our own communities. And then lastly, just want to express concern around there is an investigation ongoing. It was raised in the Chamber this week. It's been in the media regarding the alleged fraudulent activity, it would seem, of driving licences being issued to some people, and there is DVA have been sent out letters to people revoking their licences as a result. So I think it's important that we write to the Minister to get an urgent update on the matter of the alleged fraudulent issues with driving licences, because the implications of this are huge. So are members in agreement with that? Keith, you wanted in on that?
Yeah, I think it's a wee bit disappointing, considering DVA was in here last week and we're in closed session, that they didn't give us some indication of that. They didn't need to tell us all the details, but it'd be good to to find that out through the proper channels. I think they missed an opportunity, so it's just a wee bit disappointing they didn't tell us.
Yeah.
To be honest.
No, I would tend to agree with that, and I think it's disappointing as a whole that the committee haven't been really informed of this, but we learned about this through the media, and I think it would have been useful, given the implications that this has in so many areas, that it would have been something of public importance, but also importance to members of this committee and also the Assembly as a whole. So yeah, I think it's worth noting that. Are members content with that? I just want to go back, just in relation to the increase with the community transport funding. I was thinking maybe it might be useful to write to the department for details on the increase funding for community transport, and perhaps get a breakdown of the bids received, perhaps from individual community transport associations, and what was received by them, if you're content with that.
Great.
Yeah. And then just a reminder that myself and the clerk are attending an informal dinner tonight with the utility regulator. This will obviously be related to the committee's work, and I will be providing an update back to the committee just in relation to that. So it's just to let you know that that's happening this evening. Okay, so draft minutes. At page 7 you'll see the draft minutes of proceedings of the meeting on the 14th of May 2025. So I'm just seeking agreement that members are content that the minutes are a true and accurate reflection of the meeting on the 14th of May 2025. If so, I'll sign the minutes now if you're content. Yeah. Great, thank you. Okay, matters arising. So does any members have any matters arising from the previous meeting? No? Okay. Correspondence. At page 16 you'll see the correspondence memo. At page 32 there's correspondence from a member of the public regarding TransLink bus services and out of hours contact. At your table pack, page 3, you'll see further correspondence from a member of the public providing a response received from TransLink to the issues raised. So obviously we've agreed before that we don't deal with individual cases, and you'll note that this individual had subsequently been in touch with TransLink themselves and got a copy of the response. So I'm just seeking agreement that we forward to TransLink for comment on these issues raised, just given that there has been correspondence with TransLink and there's an out of hours contact that they're sort of looking to establish. Are you content with that?
Great.
Okay, thank you. At your table packs on page 6, you'll see correspondence from a member of the public regarding the termination of the contract between DVA and Worldwide and associated legal proceedings. So I'm just reminding the committee that we did, the committee has actually written to the Public Accounts Committee on this matter, but I'm just seeking agreement to write to the correspondent suggesting that the questions are directed to the department. Are members content with that approach?
Right, Chair.
Okay, thank you. So are members content to note the remaining correspondence as contained in the correspondence memo in the pack? You content? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll now move on to item 7, which is the funding implications on community transport sector. Community Transport Association, they're obviously given oral evidence to the committee today. At page 43, you'll see the Clark's memo, funding implications on the community transport sector. At page 49, you'll see funding implications on the community transport sector, Community Transport Association, written evidence. At page 55, you'll see the mapping Northern Ireland state of the sector. And at page 107, you'll see drive and change, shaping the future of community transport in Northern Ireland. So, without further ado, we welcome to the committee today Mr. Ian Wilson, Director of Down Armagh Rural Transport Partnership, Mr. Jason Donaghy, Manager of Fermanagh Community Transport, Ms. Frances Campbell, Northern Ireland Director and Head of Research, Community Transport Association, and Mr. Michael McNulty, Transport Manager, Disability Action. You're very, very welcome to the committee. Jason is no stranger to myself as a Fermanagh person.
Deborah.
Jason, I'm glad to see you're not on Fermanagh time today. You are here on time. But anyway, members, I'm just seeking agreement that the evidence is recorded by Hansard. All agreed? Yeah. Okay, look, obviously we have substantial evidence in relation to community transport. We have the evidence that has been provided to the committee, which is really, really useful for ourselves. And thank you for providing the hard copies as well of your document, Drive and Change. We really appreciate that. So I'm just going to give you about 5 minutes or so, if that's okay, just to briefly outline your evidence to the committee. The members are very keen to come to their questions. Obviously, because of time, if you don't mind, if you know one or two could take the questions, because I'm sure it is all related anyway. If you're in agreement with that, so I'll hand over to yourself, Frances. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. So I'd just like to start off by thanking you for the opportunity to come and discuss these issues with you here today, and also for your ongoing support and recognition of community transport over the past number of years. So I'm just going to briefly highlight some of the main areas outlined in our submission. So community transport is about so much more than simply getting from A to B. Time and time again, all across Northern Ireland, we hear it referred to as a lifeline by our passengers. I'm sure many of you here will have heard the same, whether that be from constituents or from personal or family connections. For older adults, people with disabilities and those living in rural and isolated areas, it's often the only way they can access their local towns to attend appointments, pick up groceries, take part in activities, or simply see a friendly face from one week to the next. So as you know, we have recently completed research profiling community transport across Northern Ireland, and its focus was very much about people, about those who use the service and those who make the service possible. And what is really clear from this research is that community transport services are already incredibly important today, but their importance and significance only continue to grow as we look towards an ageing population and rising health and mobility challenges. Our research also strongly shows that the sector itself is under considerable strain and has been so for a number of years, and the managers who've joined me here today can speak to the realities of what delivering frontline community transport services actually like. Based on our research and discussion with operators, unstable funding, recruitment and retention challenges, ageing fleets and rising costs are all putting both our services and passengers at risk. And the reality of this is that each day our operators are forced to make difficult decisions. They have to decide who can travel, whose needs takes priority, and telling someone that has no other way to get about that can't be accommodated is a reality that no organisation should be facing on a daily basis. Community transport as a sector has an absolutely remarkable network of staff and volunteers, and they consistently go over and above to support their local communities. But as part of the research, there was a real clear sense of fatigue in the sector, The effects of the funding crisis in 2023 are still being felt, and there's a growing fear among those who really rely on us that this service may not be here in the near future. And from our perspective, that's simply not acceptable. No one, least of all the most marginalised in our communities, should have to live with that uncertainty on a year-to-year basis. That said, we welcome the opportunity to come here today. We have had really positive engagements with the Minister and our team of officials, and just yesterday the Minister's announcement indicating our intention to increase funding to protect community transport services is absolutely welcome. We echo the Minister's commitment about people being the heart of decision making, because that's really all what community transport is about. While we welcome that increased level of funding, it provides certainty only for this current financial year. We really need to be looking at multi-year funding that covers the full cost of service delivery, so we can ensure that not only we can sustain service, but we can help grow it. Our sector's biggest challenge is unstable funding. To date, funding levels have remained largely static, and then this has resulted in service decline rather than meeting the local needs of our communities. Our research clearly showed that service delivery is based on available budgets rather than need. And we rely on discretionary budgets from year to year, and that doesn't give us the certainty for either planning or growth. A fair funding-based model is essential. These funding levels and ongoing uncertainty are also directly impacting pay and work conditions for our staff. It's really difficult to attract and retain staff, particularly our drivers, and despite them delivering such a vital service all across Northern Ireland, the level of remuneration that community transport offers isn't reflected in this. Also, the absence of capital investment is a major issue. We have ageing fleets, and not only are they harder to replace, the cost of keeping them on the road is getting higher and higher. And we need to look at how we can support community transport in a phased transition to lower emission vehicles. We very much believe that community transport covers the gaps left by other services, and we strongly believe this needs to be recognised as a core part of the overall transport system, not only to improve coordination, but most importantly to improve outcomes for passengers. It cannot and should not be viewed in isolation on our behalf, and this requires cross-departmental working, planning and looking at associated funding mechanisms. We also need to look at our permit structure and look at revising our licence requirements here in Northern Ireland to support a more flexible approach, particularly in rural and isolated areas. As a sector, we see the impact of our work every day, the managers here who make this possible. They remove barriers to ensure people can access accessible transport. And for those passengers, it's not just important, it's absolutely essential. We are coming here today and we know that the issues that we are highlighting are complex. We know there's much more that needs to be done, but equally as a sector on our behalf, we are absolutely committed, ready to invest the time and energy to do so, and we are absolutely determined to be part of that solution. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And as I say, thank you for the amount of evidence. It'll come as no surprise to you, this committee understands the importance of community transport in our areas, and particularly, I know speaking for myself, from a rural perspective, the importance of community transport, particularly for those Section 75 groups as well, which is vitally important. But obviously the committee has been looking at the phase review of community transport, and I'm just interested to know what engagement CTA has received from the departments in providing information for those reviews, and even at this moment in time, how engaged the department is, how regular those discussions are with yourselves.
Yep, so I can start off and the manager can come in. So on behalf of the Phase 2 review, I've been joined as part of the working group for that board. So we have regular meetings. We have, I think it's every 6 weekly. We're looking at the project plan and the outline for that. In terms of the engagement from managers, there has been 1 or 2 engagements getting feedback from the Phase 1 evaluation report and looking towards how we progress the Phase 2. There's a call out to the managers for information to look at that financial and performance data over the past number of years. From our perspective as CTA, the department are working with us, and we are absolutely committed to working with them. I suppose from the perspective of the Phase 2, our concern would be the completion of the Phase 2. Having been part of that working group and seeing the plan, it's vast. There's a lot to be done, and it's just the time frame to do that. We're keen now there is progress to push that on and to get that through to completion. Do any of you want to comment on the engagement?
Sorry if I may, and I'd look again, thank you to you all for letting us come up and present to yourselves. We appreciate it, and we appreciate everything you have done for us. I think I'd echo what Francis has said. I think the engagement has certainly improved over the last 4 to 5 months. Before that, it was very much we were in the dark. We were, as I was saying, I made a joke at one stage. We could have had 3 babies in the time that this review was going on. The review is important, but I think one of the concerns for us is the extent to which that review will be completed in full, and that it isn't kicked down the road. It is important. It's something we've been calling for a long, long time. And I think with everything else that's going on within, let's say, the public transport ecosystem, it is important that it's done now rather than it being done separately or outside or out with the wider public transport ecosystem. So we welcome it, and we'll have to say, it has improved. I think one of the things, though, was that the report was launched, and we were told that before the report would have been launched, we would have had sight of that report. So it was kind of a fait accompli when the Stage 1 report was presented. So, we were promised, but then that didn't happen. And all too often, that's what happens with community transport. Whilst we're the transport by default for all the sectors and all the different individuals, we need to be there at the start line as well and going along. It feels very much like doing on too that we're not in the ecosystem when we are. So it's welcome, and I do have to commend the staff, within the department. They are really, in terms of that engagement has really improved, and we welcome that, and we want to build on that.
So certainly from the Stage 1 it has improved then,
yeah.
and you think lessons have been learnt then, obviously, from the Stage 1 where you maybe didn't have that engagement or enough engagement in relation to the process. It has got better.
Yes.
Certainly from my perspective, I've only been in post since December, but the team, Catherine, Lona in particular, and Peter, who's leading the working group, have been really accommodating. The plan is good. I think the challenge is in looking at that model, trying to get that minimum viable community transport model in terms of costs. That our concern was that our research shows there was no one size fits all, and how that's going to be accomplished is keeping people at the heart of it, because the figures and the data are so important, but we have to look at how that is regionally balanced, how that is affected from a rural and urban basis. So the phase 2 challenge is quite complex, and that will be our fear about how long that's going to be taken to progress to completion.
So just on that point, obviously we recognise there's not going to be a one size fits all in relation to this. You've got different demographics, you've different areas, you've different journey times, all of that. So the approach is going to be very different right across the board. So to take account of that, what is community transport's view on how service measurements or metrics could be tailored to balance service quality and then also delivery as well, because it's important that we keep the quality, which we know is there, but also have that with the delivery?
I think, Chair, that's a very, very good question. But I think the department have already commissioned internal evidence around about 2 years ago when they were conducting the review into the methodology of funding. So there's quite a lot of, shall we say, high-level statistics in terms of contributing factors like lifelong limiting illness, multiple deprivation in specific partnership areas. That evidence and that research is already there. That on its own will not be sufficient, because there will need to be quite an accurate weighting in each of the areas around cost per trip, miles per trip, taking in the various geographical differences in each of the areas. But I think it is possible. I think with all the data that's out there already, I think sometimes we get consumed with the weight and the mass of data, and sometimes we have difficulties, getting to the nub of the matter. I think we have enough data already. It's just putting that apart, or putting that into effect as part of the review phase 2. And obviously, we don't have a unifying principle yet, or a single approach that's going to fit all parties, but what I do think there's unanimous consensus that this should be put in place definitely before the end of the next financial year. Whenever we decide, as part of this process, that has to be the number one priority, and whatever we decide to do has to be evidence-backed and robust. I mean, we know enough already. We just have to have the courage to make decisions based on what we already know, and understanding that, you know, in some cases, there might be winners and losers, you know, and we obviously we want to mitigate against, you know, people losing, areas losing, but, you know, ultimately, you know, we've got a real chance at this now with the sea change in personnel at the department. I echo everything that Jason and Francis has said. It's very, very refreshing based on what came before in the previous 2 years, where we absolutely knew nothing about the phase one approach. We were constantly told there's no updates at the managers' meeting, and that you know, that did impact relationships. It must be said, and there's no point coming here and nodding and, you know, poo-pieing what happened in the past. We're in a different place now, and that's fantastic. And I think the new staff change will be a major boon for this process, and along with the scrutiny that you can provide as well, panel. We look forward to try and answer some of those difficult questions in the months ahead.
Yes, Jason's out.
Sorry, if I can, Michael.
No, go ahead.
You sure?
Yeah, fine.
I think as was mentioned at the committee on the 7th, I think it was Andrew mentioned the research that we'd undertaken in Fermanagh and Omagh, looking at transport poverty. I think we need to look at how we look at need and demand within transport, full stop. We have to move beyond isochrones and hub and spoke models and how fast or how quick the crow flies. And we know that, you know, urban to urban hub and spoke works superbly well, but in the rural context, it's a different kettle of fish. And I think we really need to question the assumptions which underpin that plan and that approach, transport planning and modelling. And I think we're at a very exciting moment where we actually have an opportunity to really think, how do we future-proof and user, if you like, really centre this on the needs of the user, be that rural, be that urban. Now, what we done was, we obviously commissioned a piece of research. I drew up a brief to look at transport poverty in Fermanagh and Omagh, and the council actually took that up and looked at that. Now, that went so far, but what we discovered from that was, and you were talking about being intelligence-led and listening about the 3 pillars the last day and about behavioural change. If you want a behavioural change, you really need to understand people. You need to get with the people, if you like. We discovered that was 87% of the population of Fermanagh couldn't get to a local GP or a hospital within 2 hours by public transport, but that 100% of the population from Belfast could get to SWA within 2 hours by public transport. We also need to recognise that 70% of the population of Northern Ireland is urban, but 70% of our rural areas, and sorry Michael, I don't mean to be talking about rural, but 70%, 75% of Fermanagh is rural. So the assumptions that underpin urban cannot underpin rural. And so I think we need to be looking more intelligence driven in terms of the transport poverty, making that data more available and visible. So for instance, in terms of the transport infrastructure, and utilising geographical information systems to really build an intelligent, integrated system. And I think the thing, you know, the big frustration for us is that with the regional transport strategy coming out, 2035, we haven't been consulted on that. With the local transport, local plans, I found out about that happening through a friend who was a lecturer at Queen's and said, Jason, are you aware that this is taking place in your area? You know, we have to be in the tent because we are providing critical lifeline journeys. So I think at a regional level, we need to be looking at transport poverty. We need to be looking at how we actually plan and model, not just for now, but 5, 10 and 15 years out. So we were able to map out with quite a degree of precision and overlaying TransLink routes where areas of transport poverty exist. And the one thing I would also say is that we've also looked at quality. We've looked at the quality of our service. We've commissioned extensive research, particularly in our area, and I know the others have as well. And the feedback has been incredible. In fact, I'm going to cite, if I may, an example. Sorry, and I don't mean to take up so much time. The recent satisfaction stats for public transport were revealed about 6-8 weeks ago. And everywhere was presented, so how satisfied are you? Are you travelling on this? Are you travelling on that? There's no mention of community transport. 2 areas, there was no data presented. So if decisions are being taken on the basis of data which doesn't exist, so Fermanagh and Omagh and Mid-Ulster, the data was suppressed. So there's a sampling issue and an issue of representation in terms of the data that's being used to inform how the plan is taking place. So, we need to balance that quantitative, you're quite right, and the qualitative, but if the qualitative isn't being captured in some of the most peripheral rural areas, then we have a problem. Because what we have found to date is that planning, and again, if we go back to why community transport was first established, it was because of market failure. The private sector couldn't do it and TransLink couldn't do it in the rural areas. We could. That was in 1998. Now, the strategic context in the review says that the strategic context has changed. And my question is, well, how has it changed? Let's be really honest on how it's changed. The ageing nature of the population in the rural areas. And what we're seeing is that as more people age, they move into immobility, disability, and multimorbidity. So our client and the pressure and the need is growing and growing. So for instance, even the lifts in our vehicles, we're having to increase the weight-bearing load of our lifts. We're having to increasingly deal with very multiple complex issues, which we were never set up to do. So I think you're absolutely right, Deborah, in terms of we really do need good transport poverty data, rather than a bit being done here and a bit being done there and a bit over here. We really need to take a systems perspective to this, because rural always feels like it's weight. And I think for me, why it's so important, every year we have people sitting worrying about whether or not they're going to be able to get into life. And people, when they come to you and say, am I going to have transport, I'm going to have to give up my job, am I going to have to put my person into care, my loved one, we're delivering a service on behalf of DFI because they can't reach that cohort. And so that leads on to other questions maybe which we'll look at. But transport poverty and quality, so I'll give you an example, even SROI, social return on investment, which is a big thing which I've talked to the department for transport in England. But for ourselves, like as a cursory statement, and I should qualify that this model is not specific to Northern Ireland, it's English based, the data that underpins it. So for every pound spent in Fermanagh, there's
Jason, I don't mean to cut you off, but I'm just conscious that there will be other questions that may actually draw out some of this evidence. So if you don't mind, I'm going to move on if that's okay.
Sure, no problem.
I just want to touch on the actual funding announcement that was made by the Minister yesterday. And the committee has already agreed this morning to write to the department to find out in terms of what that funding actually looks like across community transport associations here in Northern Ireland. So in terms of that, you've sort of said that you welcome that, but obviously you want to see the multi-year budgets. It obviously plays into the funding formula that's going to be coming out as part of this review. How can you give any indication to the committee today in terms of the funding that has been reached, or that the department has come to say, we're going to give you extra funding, and what that might mean for this financial year? And are community transport associations across Northern Ireland happy with the funding announcement that has been made by the Minister?
Yeah, I can start off and you can come in on this. I suppose in terms of the overall announcement, it's absolutely welcome, increased investment, we've been calling for years, but what's not fully understood is what this means in real terms for people. We don't have that level of data at present. Based on an assembly question asked by Cheryl Brownlee, if that is the request, it equates to about an additional 1.1 million into the sector. Now, how that's broken down across the partnerships, I don't have that information. But I think that's the thing in terms of what does this mean for people? Does this funding cover inflationary pressures, additional costs on employers? Does this maintain the current level of service last year, or does it allow for expansion and growth? And we need to probably establish that and look at how that's regionally balanced across Northern Ireland. As CTA, obviously I'm not involved in the operational nature as the managers, but I'm aware there is trip restrictions in some areas that don't exist in others, and we feel that people should have accessible transport regardless of their geography or their circumstances. So that's something we're really keen to explore as well.
Anyone else?
From an operational point of view, it's difficult until we, as Francis says, get the information. Does it just cause give us money to meet our rising costs? Because that hasn't happened in the last 10 years. In real terms, it has. We've had a gradual reduction in funding, and we've had to tailor our service back. Because when you look at the service, for example, in 2015, we were delivering 102,000 trips easily with very few refusals, whereas now we're only delivering 78,000 trips because we just don't have the resources. And if you look at in generic terms, last year, for example, 2.1 million, which was the budget for example for the DAT service across Northern Ireland, just to stand still, it actually should have been 2.6. So we don't make any money out of it. In fact, it's actually costing us as organisations, it's costing us money to run it. And if I could just quote some research that Disability Action has actually physically done for the importance of the access service. 1 in 4 people in Northern Ireland are currently disabled. 9 out of 10 disabled people cannot use mainstream transport, yet there is a lack of investment in community transport.
It's very stark figures in relation to it, and I suppose it also points to the importance of it, which brings me on to my next question, then I'll come to other members. But obviously we're aware of the precarious situation that some community transport associations find themselves in, and that was raised with the department in the evidence session that we had before. And I know that within your own evidence that's been provided to the committee, you've said that without a stable funding framework, there's a real risk that essential services provided by community transport organisations will become unsustainable, leading to reduced accessibility for vulnerable populations. And you've said today that obviously you have to make decisions on who takes priority in terms of the journeys that you make. So what's your assessment of the number of community transport services that are already at that unsustainable level?
And could I maybe speak to that? I think all of us, because we're not working to a full cost recovery model. And I do appreciate, the in terms of the ask that was made, it has been announced that community transport is fully funded. But there has been a misunderstanding on what was allowed to be submitted for consideration. For instance, our vehicles, we can't include depreciation on our vehicles, which is a huge cost. So we haven't had resource to replace vehicles. And I know the committee has looked at some issues around that previously. So, for instance, this year we'll have £90,000. Now, we were fortunate to get money through the Motability Foundation, but we won't always get that. So that's 3 new buses that we've brought to the scheme effectively at no cost to the department, but we can't allocate a cost to them within our accounts. And every year, so legally, we're obliged again to have redundancy and emergency operating costs, vehicle replacement costs. We don't. We really don't. And another practical example is I need 6.5 drivers. The increase this year and what I've put into the department means I'm sitting at 5.5 because I need to up the amount per hour at the minute. What our drivers get per hour is woeful. Absolutely woeful for what they do, for the value that they create. So I think we're all in that situation. None of us operate to a full cost recovery model, and it is, and just as Michael has said quite rightly here, and we work cheek to jowl through one another. In 2014-15, Ian, if I'm right, it was 250,000 trips rural community transport was delivering around about then at the peak. We're down now to about 170,000. And we're told, base it on demand, but hold on, there's only so much funding. And we got a letter last year which said that the funding that we get this year will be the same as last year. So that's the basis upon which a lot of us went.
Yeah, absolutely.
We could have expanded, we'd love to have expanded to give our staff maybe that incentive to stay with us, because I'm losing staff. I've had 3 recruitment exercises. I'm losing them to TransLink, to social services, and the Education Authority because of the discrepancy. So we're all really pressed.
Ian, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, just to reiterate some of the points that have been made, sure. I think the depreciation is an easy win that could be resolved quite quickly if the department lessened that current demand. I mean, the department are consuming an asset for their own service, assets which belong to the rural community transport partnerships. They haven't been bought with departmental money. They have been bought or grant funded by other funders. But those assets are being consumed on a regular basis through the DAT service and the data lift service, and yet we are not allowed to account for that cost, that very real cost of replacement vehicles at the end of their natural life. So in no other accounting world does that happen. I dare say in any other department which funds community groups, depreciation is an allowable expense. So that's something that this committee could really help us try and resolve with the department. And to be perfectly honest, and I'll be very, very brief, Chair, the new sea change in personnel and the new spirit in the department, they are looking at that. They are looking at that issue proactively. But that's something that could be brought forward in this financial year and could have a real impact on all of the rural community transport partnerships and disability action. So there's things we can be doing at the moment whilst the review is ongoing that would really, really help. You know, being able to replace vehicles, that increases the stability of all the organisations, which means we're in a much better place to continue delivering services for vulnerable people.
Just lastly on that point, do you see any correlation in relation to the unsustainability of community transport associations in the rural versus urban? I know you've referenced the fact that all are unsustainable, but is there any, I suppose, more pertinent problems there in that urban versus rural aspect?
I think, Chair, just say I don't have the same operational knowledge as the managers here, but in general, I think one of the main challenges is that all organisations are struggling to cope with the current membership and demand they have. None of them have been able to advertise. They're struggling to maintain, not even sustain the services. I think from a people perspective, when we went out to the research, people want to travel more, but what they're being told is you can only travel less. You know, there's a number of restrictions all across Northern Ireland that people aren't getting out as much, and I think that rural and urban mix, I think the same challenges are the same for people. You know, they think our research showed that almost 80% had mobility challenges that stop them getting out, and that doesn't matter whether in the rural or urban context. I think people on a whole, the service they're being offered in real terms is reducing year on year, and that's something we're trying to advocate for increased investment in the sector. I know we're doing some work with social value. You know, we're trying to build that business case to invest, to save. You know, there's a lot of talk in this phase too about efficiencies, whereas from my perspective, it's quite an efficient model in terms of what these managers are able to do. It's trying to see what can we do more and look at that economy of scale and how we can use that resource more effectively.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come to other members now. Cathal?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Didn't think it was in. Thank you very much for your presentation. And I mean, to be fair, you've been planning this for a long time, and to be honest, it is welcome news yesterday for yourselves. But I think you're in a good position, to be honest. And I say it in the context of the last meeting we had with officials. It was positive. I'm not saying it was a panacea, but there seems to be an openness now. But for yourselves, and you've outlined, I think I represent a rural constituency myself, but it's not a rural urban. You know, they both have challenges out there. But I think the dynamics has changed, and people are living longer. I mean, there was a perception for years that because you live in the rural area, you rely on your own car and your own transport, and you're doing your own thing. But people are living longer now. There's a lot more things happening, and the model's changing. The demand, the need is changing, and what you're doing actually is you've been covering gaps that should be covered by somebody else. So I'm not going to pick out on any. I'm only saying that. So there's the need issue, and you're identifying and covering the gaps. That's responsibility of others, and that's what community transport's all about. So, and that's my starting point. So I agree with the multi-year budget, so I'm not going to argue that point with you, all right? My main question is this, because I've heard all this, and I'm fully supportive of it. We've seen the models. A wee example the other day is somebody had phoned me in an urban area, and I phoned round a number of people to try and address the issue. And it was a difficult one to try and get resolved. So my main question is this, and I know you're talking with data and getting data and evidence-based and all that. Is there a model out there across the Isles or across Europe that anybody, even the department, that you're aware of, that would fit here or near enough be the model to deliver? Because you're going to be here for the future, and that's the way to look at it. Not just meeting the demand now, but how you grow and present a fully viable, functioning operation going forward. This is probably my main question, please.
I think, Cathy, it's a great question, particularly in terms of the fully viable. What do we mean by fully viable? Because by its nature, it will never be viable of itself. No public transport is. It all needs subvention. And again, we exist because of market failure. I think there is an opportunity within the current review. I don't think, I think one of the things I would hope for and encourage is that the review of Ulster Bus services and community transport would take place side by side. And particularly, we keep talking about the need for integrated transport systems. We need to see, for instance, where we can add value and complement one another, work side by side. In terms of a model, the models are by and large the same the world over. There's difference. You get different types of models. So some people will hire out cars at cheap money or motorbikes. You get places that will be run by volunteers, exclusively, particularly in very middle class areas. I think we need to look at, again, the integration, the totality of the strategy. What is it going to look like in the future? Now, and I know you're saying rural and urban are the same. If we look at them,
No, I'm not saying the same. There's challenges both. Independently, that's I'm not saying.
No. But you're absolutely right. But I think the thing is, the aging demographic has taken off, and we're seeing more and more people with particular issues. And Michael's point here that disability action, quite rightly through the research, if we think about the traditional model and the people we serve, year on year they're moving further away from the bus stop model by virtue of the fact they need demand responsive door-to-door services. And I can imagine what you're experiencing, because we deliver the Disability Action Transport Scheme in Enniskillen. And because of the situation of funding, not being able to market, not being able to advertise, we've gone from what, Michael, 1,800 trips to maybe 1,200 trips. Refusals have gone through the roof. But folks, again, can't use their concessionary passes on the DATs in the urban centre. I think places are very specific and they have their unique geographies, demography and economy. Some areas will be better able and will have more opportunity in terms of transport, other areas won't. So I think it needs to be dynamic, and I think we're certainly up for that and saying, look, we're not saying that what we're doing right now is absolutely the right way to do it, but what we do know is that it's the only way that it's being done right now, but that we want to work with others to develop and evolve, a better system. Because what's really missed is those inter-community visits or journeys. So Mary to Willie to the GP to the hospital to the food bank to the probation service to the mental health services. Those are things that are not being picked up. It's about everybody wanting to move to Belfast or run to Belfast. The majority of our people, that's of no relevance to them in their lives. I do think there's learning, but one of the things I would also caution against, which seems to be an increasing assumption over time, is that it should be perhaps a volunteer-led model. And I would say volunteers are really, really important. Like, for instance, they deliver 6,000 trips for us a year, and across the board, they're massive. But we can't deliver a quality, reliable, compassionate service on volunteers alone. Our people deserve as much as folks who can get the conventional public transport. It shouldn't be at the will of, well, will I be able to do that trip today or will I not? So I think there's discussions to be had, and we would welcome that discussion. Like, I've been talking to England, Scotland. We're leading in a lot of respects.
No, just mainly because I could talk about this subject, but I understand it. But you're meeting a demand, and you've all the stats. What I'm saying to you, in the future, you're going to deliver that. But it should be. People could look at it and say it's government responsibility. I'm not saying you don't need the subsidy. All I'm saying to you, and it may not be fully financially viable. There'll have to be some kind of. But my point is, you've done a good report here. We now need to engage with the likes of health, the visits you're doing, all those things across different departments. Now's the opportunity to move to a different model, and rather than just meet the demand and the need, because things have greatly changed, to be honest, and that's the way I see it.
I think, Cathal, just sorry to come in that, I would argue that the model that current community transport currently have has been massively proven over time, and it's just about investing it. But equally, there is things we could look at, our permit structure, about that section 22 type. So, in reading TransLink recent EQA, they talked about socially important but commercially unviable. If we had that flexibility in our permit structure, we could be doing those hot spots, dead spots in local towns, and that's really what we're advocating for. It's not massive change and reform, it's just additional investment to allow that flexibility.
Kind of thinking, we need
it doesn't make sense, and it's delivering greater value for money, if you like, more bang for your buck, and that's what it's about. But the way it is at the minute, if we have a bus running up the road and there's an Ulster bus going up the road with one person on it, yet we're putting 14 people on a door-to-door demand responsive service. We have one person that's on our bus for 2.5 hours to get home and to get in. That's not,
Just a final one, because I know the chair's mind to go down.
Can I just add to that, Kathleen? You seem to have a really good unifying vision of what community transport should be, and it's about connecting that last mile, and we buy into that. We are all for that vision, but I suppose we're also concerned about removing the barriers to realise that vision. As Francis has just said, let's take a look at what works in England, where we have a more liberal permit regime that allows community transport operators to actually run semi-scheduled routes into rural areas where there is that gap. That's something that could be addressed very, very easily with the department under the current review of Section 10B. Why do we not look at these areas of good practice? It works well that these schemes that connect disparate rural communities through a semi-scheduled service which is open to members of the public, and is run on a non-profit making ethos. That's where we should be heading. Definitely, I agree with you 100%. But why are we not looking at
that? Chair, that's the conversation. That's why you're in front of us today. But I mean, I think there's opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And I think the committee has been looking at the pilot that was done in 2015 and looking about how that can be, I suppose, looked at again or revisited, or and that as well. Keith.
Okay, thanks for coming along. I have a couple of questions. I want to start with this. Can somebody explain to me in a idiot's guide in 30 seconds till a minute what your model is, where your funding comes from, and then we'll come to what you want. So tell me what's happening today, whether it's Armagh or time trodden Fermanagh, as you referred to earlier, Jason. Whichever you want. Give me a quick 30 seconds till a minute of what your model is today and where your funding comes from.
There are two separate models. There's obviously the Disability Action Transport Scheme, and there is the DALA-lift. Disability Action Transport Scheme is any town in Northern Ireland with above 10,000 people. So there's 29 urban areas. They're delivered by, although Disability Action is responsible for the service, we deliver one section of it, and the rest of it is delivered by our 10 community partners across the rest of Northern Ireland. For example, Fermanagh Community Transport delivers Enniskillen as an area. Ian with Dart delivers Craigavon, Portadown, Lurgan, Banbridge, and each of the partners do a deliver.
So where's your money coming from? What's
from the Department
all your income? Give me all your incomes.
54% thereabouts comes from the department. Then there's 80,000. So if we look at our, say, 550,000 broadly, which isn't full cost recovery, about 321,000 from the department. 321. Yep. Now, obviously, that's not accounting for this year, whatever that might be, Keith. Then we get 80,000 from the concessionary fare scheme, which used to come through DERA, the rural transport scheme, the rural travel scheme. We then lift about 50,000 on fares for those that don't hold the full pass or the half pass.
Let's call that income from trips.
Trips, yeah. That's it. And we have a very little group hire in Fermanagh, just again by virtue of the size of the population. So we generate about £20,000 for community and voluntary not-for-profit groups to hire our vehicles on a self-drive. You
talked about, that's your model in Fermanagh, 550, right?
Yeah.
What does that need to be to deliver what you want it to be?
650,000. Yes.
Right. So that's 100,000. What's that? 20%.
Yep.
Right. Is that 20% based across NI? Would you call that argument as an argument that you're short 20% across the board?
I would certainly say, as a good ballpark figure. You asked about also how we operate, Keith. Just very quickly, voluntary not-for-profit board, volunteers run our organisation, charitable company. We have 1,200 members. We deliver 27,500 trips this year. People phone us 2 days in advance and say, look, I want to be lifted and I want to be dropped off. So we don't work on time, we work within time. So we have vehicles that cover certain areas, and we say the vehicle will be in that area from 8 o'clock, and it'll start at the furthest point and work its way in and pick people up and bring them into Enniskillen and then back out. And we've tried to be really efficient in batching people. So we don't just send a bus out willy-nilly to lift one person. But our volunteers are tremendous at helping us at that with GPs. So they give us that agility and that flexibility. So we work with both paid staff. So we have 5.5 full-time drivers. When I started, we had 11 drivers. Southeast Fermanagh, we need 2 drivers. We're turning people away. We've declined 1,200 trips this year. We haven't advertised in 3 to 4 or 5 years. I'm there now 8 years. So if that gives you an idea, so it is demand responsive 3 days.
So that's 20%, that's my figure, it's not yours, but we'll talk about 20%.
Sure.
And last question, what would the 20% financial input in money do to numbers of users, we'll call it? So you talked about 250 or you talked about 250, what would that mean, the 20% financial income to users? What percentage increase would that give you?
I would hope that would begin to bring us back to build back towards the 250,000, because if you look at where we were in 2014 and look at the internal departmental review, 2014, 2015 was the sweet spot where the cost was, the cost per trip was very, very low, and I think somebody needs to go back and take a look at that. Yeah. Because demand has gone through the roof. The time bomb has gone off in terms of aging.
What's your user numbers now?
This year
across NI?
I think they're in the region.
That service is roughly 78,000 trips per year.
Total, roughly?
Well, it's over 170,000 trips, I think.
Yeah.
So that you're telling the 170 going to 250?
Yeah.
Roughly. Yeah. Right, last question. Chair.
Chair, this is part B of the
this is part D.
question. Right, okay, part B.
Health service, where are we at with the whole health service? I know Gal touched on it. Where are we at with all that?
Yeah,
as in them putting their hand in their pocket?
That very much speaks to your last question. I think what it means in trips is that people are restricted in terms of trips, and what's happening is people are prioritising health over social activities. If they have one trip a week, they'll use that to get their appointment. Where we are at health is as part of our submission, we're calling for more engagement and representation on that cross-departmental working group. We talked about the funding and looking at our structures, and we know that if we are to engage with health, we're going to need a different payment process as opposed to the grant process we have from DFI. We're very early discussions on that. At minute, it's been engaged at a ministerial level, but we really feel that the managers here need to be represented. There's going to be a change in service delivery model, and they need to be part of that discussions from the start.
Sorry, can I come in on that? Just because at the minute, 58% of our work is health related.
No, 58.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, our older folks and the other people are increasingly finding it difficult to actually get in, because a lot of that's going to daycare and day ops.
Day ops, yeah, is our biggest.
Okay, Keith.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, Andrew?
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I think it's actually brought into quite sharp focus some of the issues. Thank you for that. Just a couple of things. Because one of the things that struck me there was about how many different aspects you touch upon. You even mentioned the probation board, health, infrastructure, and data. Just to expand on, how much cross-departmental help is needed, or does it need to expand out, or what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, at our recent meeting we had with DFI officials in Lochary College, we did request that Department of Communities look at revisiting that membership. At the minute, they're not included. As Jason spoke to, we're doing a lot of services, delivering people so they can attend activities in the community. They're not represented at present, and we feel that's a massive gap.
And also, if I can add that too, what that's precipitating is we're moving back to the medical model of health. That health is the only issue. We know that the majority of people's health doesn't occur in a hospital under a GP. It's in their everyday life, having agency and independence. So all of the discussions at the minute are around transport to health, which is important and needs to be respected. But we need a social model of transport that is socially just as well. Because increasingly our folks, we're having to prioritise medical journeys, GP appointments in hospitals, particularly post-COVID.
Can I also add, Andrew, that I think it was referenced before the previous pilot around integrated transport, which was had to be abandoned, whereby I think it was 2015, 2016, purely because health did not come to the table with any support or in terms of finance, in terms to fund the model. But my big problem with that model and being involved in the pilot of that model was it was very much health driven, that it would have effectively subordinated the assets of community transports to deliver health service trips during peak peak times. So it wasn't really an integrated transport model. The losers of that model would have been the people that Francis and Jason had mentioned there. You know, older people, disabled people, people who are not travelling with a health reason, but for social purposes. So I think it's a timely reminder that if we are moving towards integrated transport or looking at reactivating any of those projects, it very much has to be community driven, and it can't be health in the lead, even though the health priority is well referenced. Absolutely, people do need to get to their GPs, people do need to get to the outpatient appointments, but that can't be at the expense of everything else that we do in terms of an integrated model. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Just coming back on, I mean, I was reading through the presentation I've met you before, and very appreciative of the service you provide. You know, again, coming from a rural area, you know, you see your buses and your drivers out quite regularly. And you made a point there as well about just where was it now? Yes, it's you know, not being a volunteer service. You know, and I think that's really important, because I think that if we value something, I think that should be reflected in it. But again, reading through this and again getting back to the main issue of it's a transport that needs drivers. We've heard stuff in previous about licensing and the licenses that the drivers are required. I mean, there's a call to action here about that. Is there anything to expand on that, or what's your opinion of the current licensing system?
I think the current licensing system, Andrew, is fundamentally flawed in its application of EU law. I think that's our starting point. I think that the DFI have misconstrued commerciality with driver licensing. I mean, their interpretation of the EU regulations have become overly restrictive and draconian, and that has had the impact of effectively stifling the sector, in the same way that we can't move to a more liberated licensing regime in terms of scheduled routes. The impact on us now is the fact that we have to have commercialised driver licences for what is essentially non-profit services. I mean, we are not commercial transport entities, and rather than in terms of what the EU would have wanted in terms of assessing on a case-to-case basis, the department have employed a blanket designation of commerciality across the entire community transport sector in Northern Ireland, and I think that is something that the EU never conceived, that voluntary sector organisations and charities that would be dragged into this net, which is essentially a commercial driving licence matter aimed at reinforcing standards across the EU on driver licensing. So I think it's not fit for purpose, it stifles innovation, it costs us money, and we have had to react very, very quickly when the new guidance was introduced, with 3 months to get all our drivers, or with 6 months to get all our drivers up to standard, or effectively the services would end. So it precipitated a real cliff edge in terms of the community transport sector. There's been no account taken of the 2019 High Court judgment, which effectively overruled the application of that blanket designation. So I don't believe the department have gone back and revisited their guidance on foot of that High Court judgment. That's something we'd like to know. Has that actually taken place? Has there been any sort of review on the current guidance? Maybe that's a question that the committee could help us in determining. We've asked on repeated occasions for clarification around the licensing. We've been asked to see the legal advice. We've been told no, because it is advice that is legally protected. CTA have also put in an FOI recently, which has been declined. So we're at an impasse in trying to get some clarification on the reasons why the department came to this legal understanding, because we're at a total loss to understand it. So the licence is not fit for purpose. It restricts and it impedes the operation of community transport on a daily basis, and it is totally disproportionate for the services that we run. We run professional, not-for-profit services, not commercial, for-profit services, and that's where the big problem lies in terms of the interpretation of the guidance.
Sorry, if I could just butt in there. The guidance originally was that, for example, I passed my driving test in 1985, and it had something like 7 categories on it, so I could drive anything up to 7.5 tons, and I could also drive a minibus. And then the interpretation was, after 15 years, that I was told that I couldn't drive a minibus, so I had to go back, reset a driving test specifically for a minibus in 2019 to be allowed to do the same job. And we had drivers who were working for our organisations for 15, 16 years, had to do exactly the same thing to be allowed to drive professionally, and that was the change. So that meant we approximately paid £2,500 per driver to go back. And I literally had to go back and reset a test for a category that I had on my licence and redo it again.
I think, Andrew, in really simple terms, that our permanent structure places in a non-commercial space, which we absolutely want to be in, and our licensing structure places in a commercial space. So we're in a grey area. We don't really understand why we should be there. We feel that we are obviously not-for-profit, non-commercial, but there is a disparity in terms of interpretation.
Cathal, I know you're looking back in on a wee point, but I see Mark's hand up, so if you don't mind, I'm going to go to Mark, if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the panel for coming in and, I suppose, reaffirming and the value of community transport that I think we as a committee do get. Now, the discussion, the focus of today's discussion has understandably been on resources and how this place can enable you to sustain the vital work that you do and enhance it, hopefully allowing services to expand and realise even better that potential and value that you have. We're still unsure whether yesterday's announcement, positive as it is, will do that. So the sooner we can get detail on that, the better. But the sooner you can get detail on it, even better, because the sector not having full detail, just something like a bizarre way of doing business. Now, one of your recommendations, however, is around the reinstatement of capital investment programmes. I was just wondering if maybe you could elaborate a bit on the the state of fleet across the sector, its age and the challenges that presents.
I think even to start off, there hasn't been capital investment across the sector since 2016. From our research at present, the Motability Foundation are the primary source, typically of vehicle replacement outside, organisations going into their reserves. I think from our research, I think over half of people were saying they needed to replace a lot of their fleet. I think the average age is coming up to 8 years for the length of vehicles, and I think the managers can speak to just how that impacts on the rising costs, the reliability, and just the strain that puts on the services.
If maybe I can, because we're doing up the asset register for the accountant for this year. We have 3 new buses through Motability, and we had to get a 4th, but the rest of our fleet dates back to 2014. We have 280,000 to 300,000 miles on each of the vehicles. I'll give you a very practical example. Last week, one of the vehicles broke down. To have that vehicle recovered is costing us £600 a time, but we're having to move very vulnerable people on very rural roads. And I witnessed it firsthand last week from one on the Decarbonisation road. It threatens its health and safety, its quality, its comfort, its reliability. Because we can't offer that reliability and that safety and that comfort and that confidence, then the folks are going to stay at home, which we know is not good for their health. So most of our fleet is highly aged, Mark, highly aged and well beyond the replacement.
I'm sure that the state of the roads doesn't help matters either.
I sure got an odd pothole.
Different subject today, Mark.
We followed the evidence session with the department. You have seen me raise the issue, and that's around, I suppose, how the department was stung, but organisations in community transport were stung as well when there was money given for capital investment in e-buses, if you like, and then with the collapse of a company, some views had spent the money and didn't actually get the vehicle. Has there been any engagement with the department as to, suppose that can be maybe rectified in some way? Because there was obviously therefore a recognition of the need for the organisations to get or have these type of vehicles.
Just again, I think we were cautious about that scheme at that time. We were given a very narrow window of opportunity. And I think the one big lesson that has to come through that is for proper procurement and to allow us to do the proper due diligence. Like, we appreciate it was during COVID and the space, there was a lot of motivation around that. But certainly for us in rural regions, the technology is not there yet. We wanted to be part of that. So that was a decision that was announced onto us. Obviously the company went into administration, we were unsecured creditors. There has been no real follow-up because each of us, in order to acquire that bus, we had to take a bus off the road, one of the old fleets, so effectively we lost 2 vehicles. There hasn't been any real discussion around it. We know there's an evaluation taking place around the EV scheme. I think we would welcome those of us that didn't actually receive the bus, we would welcome being involved. We think there's a lot of learning we can bring to it because we've invested a lot of time and effort and energy in trying to learn and scope out what was and wasn't possible. And we think it's learning that's important across the board. And I'm sitting on multi-governmental grouping that's looking at vehicles, be that police, ambulance, and others. So the lessons are across the board.
I would come in. We were one of the organisations at Disability Action that was lucky enough to get a vehicle. Would I go down that road again? I would probably say no. While the ethos is good, the technology isn't quite there. I would say electric cars at the moment are probably on version 10 of an electric car, whereas minibuses are on version 1, version 2. We have a bus that's sitting that only does 70 miles per day because of the amount of kit that we have on and tail lifts and stuff. So the distance it's not economically viable, and we have a very restricted use. So as I say, more input into the sort of technology behind it and more due diligence would probably be better.
Yeah.
Sorry. And sorry, so had you to take off
we took a vehicle off as well, off the road in exchange for the electric vehicle.
And have you suffered then a sort of net loss in terms of miles? Or?
Yes, we suffered a net loss. For example, most of our vehicles will run all day from 8 o'clock in the morning to 6 in the evening. This particular vehicle you can probably only run to about lunchtime because you have to come back to get it recharged because the infrastructure isn't there for actually recharging it out on the road and the timing. So it doesn't work. If I was to do it again, I would be looking at a hybrid type of vehicle rather than just all electric.
Yeah.
No, well, I suppose it underlines the importance of, if there are any schemes as such coming forward, around capital investment that you guys are involved in the design of the schemes. Yeah. And I know COVID was a different time. It was kind of like Brewster's Millions. There was just, it appeared that money needed spent. But no, thank you, folks.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark. Cahill, you were looking on the point, very brief, if you don't mind.
Yeah, not Brewster's Millions, anyway. just the issue. It was quite interesting when Keith was asking the questions about the actual funding of the model. I mean, we tend to forget all those missed visits. That's an impact on the department, which could possibly add up for the difference. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely.
And that has to be reflected as well.
Look, if you even look at the review, let's say by the department, which is absolutely welcome and really aligns with the fantastic work that CTA have done in collaboration with ourselves and Disability Action and others. If we were to lay over that the current demographic data, like we've been told that put this out on the basis of need. We have never been able to put it out on the basis of need. It has been within a fixed and declining envelope. The last day that you heard evidence, it was said, well, how can we squeeze more value out of the current envelope of 1.2 million? The sponge is dry. The sponge is dry, and the need has changed. And everything again that Ian has said about the licensing and the semi-scheduled routes, I've been advocating that I think we've been advocating for donkeys for years. And we would welcome, again, that inclusion, that we are a key component of the transport ecosystem. We can't be outside of it. And you cannot measure the merit or the value of your overall public transport system without looking at the totality of the system. And this thing about doing a wee bit over here and a wee bit over there and then trying to make them meet is not suffice.
And I think if I can, Chair, very, very briefly, I think that feeds into Mark's point, Cathal, where if we're looking at the totality of costs for community transport, replacing the vehicle asset is key to that, because that is an existential threat to most operators. If we can't replace buses, we're out of business. That's the end of it. And, you know, that's why we try to build up the reserve levels as much as we can, so that we have some sort of structured programme to replace vehicles at the end of their natural life. And ultimately, that's why the point around depreciation and me being able to, you know, add that cost to our balance sheet to the department is so important, because we have gone out and secured funding, non-departmental funding, to bring these vehicles on stream to replace our fleets. We're not allowed to offset the cost of that to the department through our submissions year on year. So that's another area for a quick win, that if that could be afforded in the months ahead, that would make a huge impact, because unfortunately, folks, there's a lot of demands on community transport, and there's a lot of people out there, a lot of stakeholders that, you know, will want to milk a cow, but they don't want to feed it. And I think, you know, that's the situation that we find ourselves in.
Excellent analogy, Chair.
Keith, you'd indicated very quickly.
You're talking my sort of language. I have a question regarding fares. Jason, you talked about 50,000 on fares, right? Which is roughly 10% of your 550. I added your three figures up, you're at 450, but we'll not worry about the forensic accountant today, well, 100. The question I'm asking is, what's the 50,000 is in the 10% for fares like with respect to TransLink as an income based? So what's, I don't know the answer to this, do we know what TransLink's bringing in on fares, percentage wise? You know what I mean?
We can look at that.
Again,
it's only a comparison.
No, absolutely. But I think that's something that we would welcome. But again, if you go to, for instance, Open Data NI, where when your data should be publicly available, and there's the network is up there, we had to go to England to get the data, the network interrogated for that transport poverty piece. Just again, like I said, about the public data on which service have you used, suppressed. This is what we need more of. We need that.
It's just to get an understanding what people are paying as in Joe Public. Well, for you, with me, the 10%, plus the 80,000 you talked about from Madeira, which I presume is classified as fares as well. So that's 130,000 based on a 530 total. Interesting to know what that's like from the transit model, but it's just to get a comparison. You know,
that's something we can look at as part of the phase 2 review. We can ask that proportionality to be factored in.
Super, thank you. Thanks to our forensic accountant there, Keith.
Sorry, management from my strong point.
You're all right.
I just wanted to check in on I suppose 2 points, if you don't mind. Obviously, we're keen to see integration too of how community transport plays its part in terms of the overall transport strategy and plan, and that's something that we've been looking at here in the committee as well. Obviously, we're aware of that 2015 pilot, and I suppose from my perspective, a bit of frustration that nothing seems to have moved forward from that. And I'm just keen to understand, in terms of the discussions that you're having in terms of the phase review, does there seem to be much of an appetite or attitude to bring TransLink to the table, to have those discussions again? Because whilst we're talking about cross-departmental and looking about the review, but TransLink also need to play its part in having those conversations with yourselves as well, in terms of how you integrate into the system.
Yeah, just in terms of the connections with TransLink, at the recent event in Stormont about accessible travel, I met a number of TransLink colleagues that were at my table. I've scheduled some follow-up conversations from that. I know I'm due to meet Graham Smith, as seen as EQA, about how we can work together. So we are actively trying to do that. We recognise that's a gap from our behalf as well as from the department perspective. And the same for the regional transport strategy. I have a meeting scheduled for the end of this month about how we can start involving. But it has been slightly reactive rather than that proactive engagement, which we hope to address.
Do you not think that's something that the department should be playing a role in too, in terms of, you know, facilitating those conversations.
Given that the department's the single shareholder in the Northern Ireland Transport Holding Company, that should be a given.
Yeah.
Again, we haven't been consulted on the 2035 strategy. We're a key stakeholder. We're funded by the department. We're part of the public transport. You know, on some of the policy communication, we're noted as public transport, and then on some, we're community transport. We're community transport that operates in the public transport space. We're moving thing. So we would welcome that. We'd love that. It's not an us versus them. It's how can we work side by side to achieve more, particularly within difficult budgetary environments. But this is one of the frustrations. I think goes back to the licensing. We're dealing with a department that has all those levers. And when we come to the meetings with the officials and we ask those questions, you would think that the department can talk internally and say, can we affect this? Can we get clarity on that or the other? So that has been one of the main frustrations over the years.
Could I just add, Chair, that I'm old enough to remember a time when, Translink depot managers would have attended the committee meetings of rural community transport partnerships, and that was a departmental requirement, actually. Now, that's going back some years, maybe 15, 16 years ago, but it didn't always used to be this way, where we had very limited contact with Translink. I mean, I think there's a huge job of work to be done here in repairing those relationships. Not repairing them, but actually connecting them, getting them hooked in, because this is where the whole, the potential licensing changes around being able to offer semi-scheduled routes. Well, that won't be able to happen without Translink's involvement, to tell us the areas where, routes have been removed, so that we can go in and subvent that route with a semi-scheduled service. So now's a very timely, it's a great question. Translink should be at the table, they should be actively involved, because can we really talk about integrated transport without them?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
And just lastly, obviously this is a important moment for community transport in terms of the phase review, and obviously this second part is looking at the funding and the funding formula and how that all comes to be. Whilst that's positive, is there a slight concern or worry that will be a very rigid funding formula for a X amount of years, where you won't have that opportunity again to feed into, we've talked about electric vehicles, technology change, all of that. So what discussions are you having in terms of that phase review about the flexibility of that funding formula in the context of things that may happen on a multi-year budget?
In fairness, I think, to the individual that's leading the review, there is engagement that's going to happen over the next while, and we hope, to convey some of our thoughts and issues around that. I think the big one in all of this, though, Deborah, is we don't have a policy home. We don't have a policy home. So it's easy to say they don't exist. But when we're needed, we really need it, we exist. So I think we can talk about moving the deck chairs and stuff about, but we actually need strategy. We need to be part of the regional transport strategy. It can't be just a convenient add-on that can take up the leftovers, because our people are not leftovers. I think the big thing that whatever happens within this review will hopefully feed into the other reviews that are ongoing, and I think we must be clearly demarcated within that. And again, recognising the cross-departmental nature of it, that, DERA, again, health, DFI, we recognise that we bring value. Like if you look at the programme for government, we cross-cut all of it. So I think we need to be in there at the heart of that transport policy, but also looking at that strategic landscape in terms of transport. Who's really best placed to do what? And I think one of the other things was, sorry, and I'm going to stop then, I promise. There was a question about the behavioural change and how do you affect that behavioural change. And let's say from Enniskillen to Altnagelvin for a hospital appointment. And people are talking about putting on an Ulster bus to make that happen. That was done in the past and it didn't work. We know why it doesn't work, because we've talked to the people and we've developed pilots to try and address that. It doesn't work for the very reasons we've already talked about. So there is real value and merit in us sharing that, in developing and leading that behavioural change. as well. So we can bring more than just community transport.
Yeah, but to answer your question, Deborah, I think the challenge of the phase 2 funding methodology is massively complex, and you know we are at the early stage of it, and there is calls out for that information, that data, that analysis, which is so important. But the piece of putting that together, contextualising that in terms of size, operation, the locality, the people it serve, is massive. And whilst we will have concerns, we hope that this process of engagement and co-design will continue throughout that, so that whatever model is then is agreed by all the managers, people that run the service, and that's something we'll be pushing for throughout.
Okay, look, thank you so much for your time at the committee today. We really do appreciate it, and we will be continuing to look at this as well, because this is just not the end of it. So thank you for your time. We really do appreciate it, and we look forward to the details of finding out all the funding that has been received. So thank you.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for your time.
Okay, members, there was just a couple of things that I noted down there from the meeting, just that we could follow up with, if there was any other things that you had noted as well. Just in relation to the cross-departmental meetings, maybe it's worth just checking out the discuss there about extending that out. Are you content that we'll look at to see whether there is any plans, or whether they are looking at that, or I think, yeah, Keith.
What did Frances say in that? Did she say she was on that? But,
Yeah,
but the what do you call it? The managers weren't. Is that what you talked about?
Yeah, I'm nearly sure. Yeah.
I think that was discussed in the chamber one time, but I just can't remember who was on that working group. It'd be good to.
I think it is health and DERA.
But at what
and
level
DFI.
is that? Do we know what level?
I think that was talked. I think it was talked the last time about ministerial level in those meetings. So maybe we could just check out.
Yeah, let's check.
I think we'll check out just the membership of the cross-departmental meetings, how regular they are, and if there's any discussions around extending that out to anybody else. Are you content with that? Yeah. The next one just was around the licensing and that 2019 High Court ruling, just to check if the department has revisited that in terms of the commercial voluntary.
Yeah, I think it's a curious, as I say, it's a curious grey area. That
Yeah.
yeah.
So you're happy to, that we asked just to, if the department is looking at that. And then just, I think as well, just to check in relation to the review of TransLink and CTA, just to see, just obviously the review is happening with CTA and TransLink separately, but what plans the department has to look at that in together. So just to check in relation to that. Happy with that. Was there any other points that anybody had raised, or anything else that anybody wants to? Happy enough? Yep. Okay, well look, I know it's warm in here. Are members content to move on? Yeah. Okay, we'll move on now to item 8, which is the update on approach to transport decarbonisation, Department for Infrastructure oral evidence. At page 137, you'll see the Clerk's memo update on approach to transport decarbonisation. At pages 141, you'll see update on approach to transport decarbonisation, Department for Infrastructure written evidence. At your table packs at page 10, you'll see departmental PowerPoint presentation. So, without further ado, we welcome to the committee today Ms Shan Kerr, Director of Transport Planning Policy, Department for Infrastructure, Mr James Redmond, Head of Transport Planning and Modelling Department for Infrastructure, Mr David Strahan, Head of Transport Decarbonisation Unit, Department for Infrastructure. David, this could be the last time you're at our committee, I hear. So I want to not anything that I have done. David,
I hope you're not preempting and I'm going to say something.
David, I've heard on the grapevine that you're retiring. Is that true?
Yeah.
Well, look, I want to, on behalf of the committee, thank you for the evidence that you have given to this committee, and I want to wish you well. For sometimes they say you don't retire when you retire, but I wish you well for the future. So yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, committee. It's
No
been a
problem.
pleasure.
it wasn't anything that I had done. And also welcome Orla Gray to the Committee Head of Transport Policy, Department for Infrastructure. So, folks, as per usual, if you wouldn't mind, we obviously have your evidence with PowerPoint presentation as well. So if you wouldn't mind briefly going through that for about 5-10 minutes, and then I'll come to members' questions if that's okay. Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair and members, and thank you for the opportunity to brief the committee today on the Department's approach to transport decarbonisation. I would like to briefly provide the committee with some background on the evolution of the Department's approach to transport decarbonisation. Planning for the Future Time for Change was published in June 21 and outlined how the Department's priorities for the future of transport could be supported by improvements in the planning, management and development of our transport network. In its approach to tackling carbon reduction, the Department recognised that it needed to be ambitious in tackling climate change. Central to this approach was encouraging the use of more energy efficient modes of transport and active travel, where possible, to reduce carbon emissions. The hierarchy at this stage for reducing the carbon impact of transport emphasised substituting trips as the most impactful step required, followed by shifting modes, for example, using the bus instead of the car, and finally by switching fuels. When the Climate Change Act was introduced, it significantly altered the context in which we must plan for and deliver transport here. Given that surface transport is the second biggest emitting sector here, we have a significant role to play in helping Northern Ireland reach net zero by 2050. We realised early on that we had limited Northern Ireland specific data available to help inform decision making. So we set about developing our own transport emissions model. This model, which is deemed best in class across these islands, has helped us to better understand Northern Ireland's baseline emissions and how the transport fleet actually functions and differs depending on its locality, for example, urban and rural areas. Our modelling has demonstrated that focusing on removing car emissions by transitioning from petrol and diesel cars to zero-emission vehicles has a much bigger impact than previously envisaged. When this is combined with further actions to switch other vehicles to zero-emission fuels, such as light goods vehicles or vans, heavy goods vehicles, buses and coaches, this ensures that the transport sector can fully decarbonise by 2050. You've been provided with a presentation on the Department's transport pathway to net zero, and James will shortly talk you through this. But at this point, it's important to highlight that the switch to zero emissions vehicles, whilst the most impactful from a decarbonisation point of view, is only one of 3 policies in this area. Shifting modes of transport from private car journeys to more sustainable travel alternatives such as public transport and active travel clearly has a role to play, especially in our urban areas. In the short term, it helps to reduce the number of journeys undertaken by petrol and diesel cars, while having many other benefits, such as to your health and well-being. And furthermore, we are mindful of the fact that 16% of households don't have access to a car and so rely on public transport. And the third policy relates to reducing the need for some of our journeys and takes account of the increase in online services and things like combining journeys, for example. I hope this provides some useful high-level context, and if the Chair is content, I'll hand over to James.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Shan, and thanks again, for the invite today to provide this presentation on our approach to the transport decarbonisation. I suppose the purpose of this presentation is really just to give you an overview and in relation to the approach that we as a department have taken, particularly in relation to that decarbonisation, but as the transport sector lead, or the department that is in the sectoral lead for the transport. I suppose the approach that we've taken, and again leading on from what Shan had mentioned, it has been driven by very much robust data analysis and modelling, and its outcomes have been grounded by its strong evidence base. I suppose just to start off, and I'm not going to dwell on this in much in relation to the Northern Ireland Climate Act, got its royal assent in 2022. Within that act, in terms of set legally binding targets for net zero for 2050, and then also interim targets for 2030 and 2040. It's important to highlight that those targets are not sector specific. They are across the NI, all the NI economy sectors. No, not the economy sectors, all sectors within the NI economy, and ensuring that sort of collective responsibility and that cross partnership and across all departments. Therefore, under the Act, DFI have no responsibility as the transport sector lead, and they have a legal duty to be able to contribute in relation to how we will contribute to those targets and that net zero by 2050. And that will sort of be demonstrated through the sectoral plans and the climate action plans that have been developed on or have been developed to date. It is important when we set out in this journey and understand in relation to what those targets meant and for us as a department, but also in terms of the transport sector. In terms of we really had needed an understanding of relation to how and by how much and what those emissions meant to us as a transport sector itself. And then to do this, I suppose we as a department needed to get a real understanding of our baseline emissions. And I suppose that's in terms of we've sort of really got into in terms of interrogating, what the baseline emissions were and where they were coming from, the sources and the main contributors. I suppose in terms of just to give a brief outline in relation to transport sector itself is the second main contributor to the Northern Ireland climate emissions, with 18% of that. 18%, 88% of that is related to the tailpipe, in terms of, and 68% of that, 63% of that relates to the car passenger. I suppose then that sort of followed through in terms of how we as a society know in terms of how travel and then our typical journeys, which typically in terms of 69% of all our journeys are undertaken by the private passenger car. I suppose it's important to look at it in terms of when we're sort of reviewing in relation to where we've come from and where we need to get to. I suppose the white line there on the graph shows what we've been doing and undertaking for the last 30 years, and you can sort of see that white line has sort of bobbed around the 1990 baseline figure that in terms of we will be reported at as we go along this journey up to 2050. The yellow line is the trajectory in relation to where we need to go. I suppose in relation to, you can see that sort of small blip in the white in white happened in around that 1999 to 2019 and 2020. So in relation to, you can see that during that COVID and in relation to restrictions in relation to how we travelled, in terms of that was the impact on the carbon. So in relation to, and that was in terms of where a lot of people were at home, staying at home, and there was a reduced journeys. So understanding that and also understanding the trend data, in terms of, we sort of, as Shan had already mentioned, there's sort of three policy areas in terms of switching fuels, shift modes and reducing journeys. But in relation to trying to be able to understand in relation to how we get onto that yellow trajectory, in terms of how do we do that, and also what is the most impactful, in terms of what is the scale in relation to of change that would be required. And also in terms of the big dilemma is in terms of what does that look like in terms of how do we do this fair and equitably as well. And that's critically important. And I suppose in terms of that's one of the areas in terms of where we sort of focus on that switch in fuels, particularly in terms of that shift in modes and that reduced journeys, very much links to our transport plans in relation to our urban areas and how we can shift that travel, but recognising that there's a need for people still to travel by no car. So also important was in relation to the Climate Change Commission themselves had sort of provided guidance in March 2023 in relation to sort of recommendations in relation to the trajectory in relation to how we were going to achieve those set targets in terms of net zero in the interim 2030s and 2040s. But this was all caveated the fact that in terms of Northern Ireland's data was very poor, and what essentially was that we were a factor of what was happening across in GB. Very early on in terms of a recognition here that in Northern Ireland we are kind of a different beast, from across the water, not even in terms of our scale, but in terms of our motorway network, even our rail network, etc. In terms of, and also in relation to even in terms of the fuel type in relation to what and the urban, the rural split that we have here in Northern Ireland. So you can see there in relation to where we sit in relation to diesel vehicles, predominantly around that 55% mark in terms of diesel vehicles compared to that less than 40 and less than 20 in southern England. So in terms of, it's a very, very different sort of picture, and that needed to be reflected in relation to where we needed to get to, and also in terms of understanding in relation to how we were going to get on that journey to that trajectory. So what did we do? We set about in relation to developing our own bespoke transport emissions model. I suppose there's a lot of data and things that underpin this, but I suppose the space that we're in here is we're not in Excel documents, we're in big data. So essentially what we have built for Northern Ireland is a stock model. So a stock model is an understanding in relation to the size, the type, the fuel type, of all the vehicles that we have here in Northern Ireland, taking the opportunity then in terms of our scale, but also in terms of one transport authority, one public transport authority, but also in terms of our MOT systems, a wealth of data that we were able to use and utilise to allow us to understand this stock model and in relation to over time how long vehicles are retained within the stock, how they leave the market, but also in terms of how new vehicles, in terms of how that affects the emissions overall. I suppose in relation to what we're saying, we're in the space of big data here. So in terms of for every time we can churn through the data that underpins a lot of this models, we're talking about 500 million data points that has been hit. So in terms of that's the scale of what we're looking at in the granular detail that we're able to get into. But what this has given us a real insight into risk, into how our emissions will change over time, particularly in terms of policy, but also in relation to, for us as a department, in relation to how we will report going forward and monitor in relation to our progress and our effectiveness in terms of measures, in terms of this has allowed us to understand and be able to model that, to give us that sort of evidence-based and data that underpins in terms of why we're doing certain things, but also in terms of understanding in relation to what works and what doesn't work. I suppose in terms of these are just the sort of insights. So in terms of when we go back to in terms of the data that underpins this and in relation to what we were able to test, we're sort of able to test a number of different scenarios. So in terms of sort of policy measures, in terms of that 2035 Z mandate and the VETs, in relation to what influence that will have on the stock. In terms of as we approach that 2035, all new vehicles will have to be EV. So in terms of using trend data and an understanding in relation to how vehicles behave, we're able to map out and understand in relation to how over time we can decarbonise. I suppose interesting in terms of we've got a full stock model in here, so it's not just in relation to our car passengers, we're also looking at the HGV traffic and how we could potentially influence that going down the line later on, in relation to 2040. But as you can see, those graphs and in terms of what we're trying to illustrate is that in terms of how that diesel petrol hybrid vehicles will know currently where we are today and where they sit, but in terms of how over time they will sort of leave the stock, but in terms of EVs will enter the stock in relation to that decarbonisation profile. I suppose in relation to that decarbonisation pathway, so I suppose where we are currently today and in relation to the modelling that underpins all this is in relation to allows us to quantify and understand in relation to what will be our contributions over time on a yearly basis, on a carbon budget basis, or in terms of the target basis. And I suppose it's important to mention, as I mentioned in relation to the sector, not all sectors will decarbonise at the same rate. We're all at different time, but in relation to what we've been able to do is an evidence-based pathway to show in relation to how we will contribute to the decarbonisation, that net zero aim by 2050 over time. What you'll see is in terms of where we are currently is in terms of as the transition of vehicles and the turnover of vehicles to EV, in terms of we're on the trajectory in terms of 2050 net zero. What you'll see is there's a slight gap there. There's still a residual impact in relation to, and that relates to sort of HGV traffic. But where we are now is this has allowed us to have a sensible approach in relation to what we need to do and how we can accelerate and look at other sort of policies measures to bring that black line further down to that sort of net zero. So in summary, in terms of the department's TEM is a sort of very powerful policy development tool that's put us in a real strong position to quantify, forecast and monitor. There's been recognition from all the DFT and analysts and the Climate Change Commission analysts in relation to the level of detail and also the level of detail that we have here for Northern Ireland itself. The foundation pathway indicates a significant reductions in emissions over time as the vehicle fleet decarbonises with a transition to low and zero emission vehicle technology. We haven't lost sight of the other policy measures in relation to that shift modes and the reduced journeys, but what this has allowed us to do is for this carbon budget period, we've been able to understand in relation to what is our contribution in this first 5-year period, but then in terms of allow us to sort of do further policy development, particularly in terms of the transport plans, understand in relation to how we can accelerate and bring that black line down further to show further developments. So in summary, I suppose the transportation emissions model has give us a real good insight and has shown in relation to how we can take opportunities in terms of a size and scale, but also in relation to that in terms of it's been really beneficial for other sort of parties, particularly in terms of an organisation such as Climate Change Commission, who are now using the data that we underpin, and we're also using that data to influence in relation to the demand with Sony and the NI Electric. So in terms of we're sort of providing that one data source that is then being used widely across departments, but also in terms of organisations to inform what they need to do down the line. So that is a very quick summary in relation to where we are, but thank you for listening.
No problem, thank you. I'm sort of flabbergasted the amount of data and things and the work that has been going on to try and collate all of that, because that would have been a mammoth task to try and get all of that together. So I'm under no illusion around that in terms of the legislative need that's there as well from a departmental point of view. I suppose in terms of the PowerPoint, and I was looking at this, even from my own point of view, I know during COVID, my car didn't know what hit it whenever it had to sit in the driveway for a prolonged period of time. But the graph, the figures are quite stark in terms of where we need to get to, yet, you know, there wouldn't have been as many journeys on the road, and we all know that from that time of COVID, how quiet the roads were. It's quite scary how we're going to reach that. And, you know, we really at this moment in time have the main policy is vets and the Z mandate. I suppose my question leads on to the fact of, do you honestly think we are going to reach those targets from a departmental point of view? Of that 2030, 2040, 2050 targets, because it's been a mammoth task to get to this stage already, but we're not too far off 2030. So what's your view on, will there be enough sufficient time and a lead-in time for people in terms of meeting this target?
Sure, it's really funny that you say that, because James will know that was sort of my immediate thought as well. And whenever I saw the data, I was like, well, you know, it looked like there were no cars on the road, so how come it's such a small dip, relatively speaking? And we have talked about why that might have been, and I think a lot of it comes down to there was still freight, and you know, we were still getting deliveries, and actually we probably got more deliveries, and that might be some kind of interplay into why that has happened. In terms of, you know, if we look back to kind of that time, we didn't have this data. Like, we were kind of working somewhat blind, and I think, you know, the fact that we now have it and that we can model this gives us confidence that yes, in fact, we can do what we are committed to do. I think, as James has said, like, it's a forecast. You know, the trick will be feeding in the live information then as we get it, and working out how we can flex to actually make sure that we do achieve. But we have the data now to support that. The data, that kind of S-curve is built on essentially the various UK-wide bans on vehicles. So, you know, we've talked about the petrol and diesel ban and the associated ZEV mandate. The next sort of chunk of emissions that we need to look at is around freight. And there's the previously announced ban on petrol and diesel freight, 2040, I think. So, you know, the issue is now very much that we're focused on a UK-wide basis and with colleagues in Ireland around, well, how do we address that for freight? Is the answer a kind of ZEV mandate equivalent, or how do we do that? And I think the interesting thing with freight is just in terms of tackling that issue will require all of us to work together, just because of the way freight moves. You know, it doesn't just travel around Northern Ireland. Yeah. And so we've actually managed to benefit quite a lot from work others are doing in this space and joining in with that. And very recently, the transport ministers were all over in Belfast for the British-Irish Transport Sectoral Ministers meeting. And as part of the Forward Look work plan, freight is one of the 4 areas that we're going to be working on. So I think it does give us confidence. It's a massive challenge, but I think that we're starting to see essentially the top of an S-curve, and that, you know, over the next kind of decade, it's a multi-decade plan, you know, we will start to see that real drop. I think until very recently, and possibly the data is a bit of a lag. You know, we were the only sector that actually the emissions were going up in Northern Ireland. So, you know, we're in no way not aware of the challenge. But I think we're more confident than we were. I don't know if
you know, I think it's just reflective in relation to, you know, the proportion of EV vehicles on our roads currently today. No, it's still quite small. So in terms of that hasn't come through, and that benefit of that EV vehicles, no, hasn't come through in the data just yet. But in relation to as that proportion increases, and the diesel and the unleaded vehicles diminishes, kind of way, that's where you start to see the benefit. And I think in terms of where we were with the modelling, and particularly in relation to the guidance that was coming through, in relation to we needed to have a credible plan to understand in relation to, we can't just flick a switch and this will happen overnight. No, in terms of this is going to be over over decades. No, in relation to, and we're not forcing anybody tomorrow to go and buy an EV. It's part of that decision that in terms of it is coming down the line and that communication, that piece behind that. But I suppose what the data is reflecting is that we're not expecting everybody to do that overnight, but in relation to what we will get there over time, because there's vehicles themselves that can only be retained for a certain length of time, and they will do their duty for a certain length of time, and at that point in time somebody will have to trigger. And I think what we've been able to build into that data is not just the new vehicles coming in, it's how those second-hand vehicles are sort of used, and particularly in terms of when you're rural locations, people hold on to those diesel vehicles for long. They're quite wedded to them, kind of rightly so, because they've got different uses for them compared to people who live in the urban.
Clear an interest there.
But I think that's the I suppose in terms of the level of information and probably the detail that we've got into, we're able to really interrogate that. But it's agile also, that we're learning as we go on, that in relation to, as time goes by, we're able to monitor and feedback to go, we said, but what actually happened, and then use that learning and understanding in relation to be reflect forward, and then potentially looking at other policy areas where we need to bring those forward to help accelerate that, to bring that line curve further down than what we'd initially forecast.
So just to check or clarify, what consequences for the department is there in terms of failing to meet the 2030 targets?
The 2030 targets are Northern Ireland wide. Yeah. So in terms of, we have all of our policies are quantified and we feed that into DERA, and then DERA is able to work with all the other sectors to see in terms of the 2030 targets. So we wouldn't necessarily be cited in anything other than our bit.
It could be balancing and out.
Well, definitely in the short term, we will not be contributing as much, but we're starting from a different place. Other sectors are much further ahead in some cases. But by 2050, for Northern Ireland to be net zero, we need to be net zero, especially given the size of the sector. But I think this is, as James has said, the trick will be being sort of fleet of foot and being able to respond to where the data tells us versus where we thought we'd be, and learning from that, and then adapting our policies to suit.
Chair, I was just going to say, you mentioned the VETS trading scheme. I think committee have been with us on this journey, bringing that VETS trading scheme through, and we've seen how not only in getting it through the assembly process and getting it on the statute, and the benefits that will have in producing vehicles for the second-hand market, and not just introducing them as new vehicles. But that journey will probably be replicated, in respect of the other sectors now, because we're going to have to take the data that James has been able to put together, look at it in Northern Ireland context, and work with our colleagues in DFT to see how we can make sure that the impact can be felt here on the basis of the needs that we actually have. So I think that's something that we've been very conscious of when we've been talking to our counterparts, both through the British Irish Council and through contact with the Irish government and the UK government.
So in terms of that, obviously Freight is now the big next step, I suppose. So what is the department doing in terms of engaging with those that industry next? Mm-hmm. And so people aren't under any illusion as to what could be coming down the track in 2040, because that's going to be huge in terms of businesses and how they change their, particularly if they're looking at their fleet and managing that as well. And we've just heard from Community Transport Association there and how they do that. It was interesting whenever they were in, they were saying that their minibus fleet, it feels like the electric vehicles in terms of that is version 1, whereas cars feels like it's at version 10. So what engagement is happening with those sectors at this moment in time?
And I think as we have highlighted, we've very much taken a deliberate approach for resource reasons and many other reasons to focus on the things first that will bring about the most impact. So we have focused on the car and the private car deliberately, because that is the biggest chunk of emissions, and we need to do that as quickly as possible. So that has been a deliberate approach in terms of we can't do everything all at the same time. And we've spoke earlier about the potential, the ban on high emitting freight is 2040. So we're looking at this decades long approach. This is not about tomorrow. we engage regularly with the freight sector across the department. We're only starting to look at what we think we need to do. We don't have necessarily answers in terms of being able to, with any authorities, sort of say what is going to happen. We're working with colleagues in that space, but we do generally engage, with the freight sector.
And we've seen, I think one of the things that we've really seen the benefit of over the last sort of 12 months, 18 months, was that direct stakeholder engagement is key to us understanding the needs of the freight sector. We know that we've got a freight sector that is, predominantly privately owned small companies who are working, trying that, and through groups like the CBI, we continue to engage with them to try and understand what we need to feed back in that Northern Ireland context when we're talking to DFT, when we're looking at freight movement through the British Irish Council Forward Work Programme, to see how those impacts or any lessons learned, say for example in Wales, which have a very similar similar freight arrangements there, so we can see how those work together. So that's something that the department will continue to foster those relationships.
Do you think that there's still a wee bit of nervousness around vets? Obviously, we've had the consultation. Westminster obviously had the consultation that was going on around Christmas time, and obviously there will have been engagement as well, I'm presuming, from the department and DFT as well in relation to that. You maybe speak to that as part of your answer, but has there been ongoing engagement with the stakeholders in terms of the motor industry and how vets is actually rolling out across Northern Ireland since then?
Yeah, I think there was two elements to the consultation. So there was the rollback of the 2035 petrol and diesel ban to 2030, which is a reserved matter, which the UK government were working with the industry, particularly in a period of sort of economic instability in respect of the markets. So that was something that needed to be done. In conjunction with that, there were flexibilities that they were wanting to build into the actual vehicle emissions trading scheme itself, which was the second part of that consultation. So all of that has been done through a consultation process. We don't have any manufacturers in Northern Ireland. So generally speaking, the big players are in the UK, and we've got issues over jobs and stability of the markets and vehicle supply and everything. So that was all part of that bigger economic conversation that was going alongside what the outputs might be of vehicles that will help us decarbonise in the transport sector. So that was that big move. But it has continued to work, and we will have our say in respect of how those trading schemes operate in future, because of the nature of the setup of it, where it has to be agreed across all 4 nations. So.
And I think as well, just in terms of the consultation, it was important to get a response back quite quickly, just to provide that certainty to the market. I think, and whenever there's a consultation and the answer's not known afterwards, that can bring uncertainty. But I think the fact then that the response came out quite quickly, that's provided the sort of
some clarity
in terms of the market.
Now, at the present moment, it still has to be legislated for. So that was the government response that said they would move back to 2030. So the legislation still has to go through. So that will be done through statutory instruments and the flexibilities to the scheme. So my colleagues will be back to talk to you about it.
You're disappointed you'll not be, David.
But yes, we will continue to keep you involved as that progresses.
Yeah. And when do you expect to, or when do you hope, I suppose it's difficult given the legislation, but when do you hope to expect to see that information starting to feed through more on the graph, I suppose?
We do. There's a lag, which is quite frustrating in terms of the sort of, you can speak more to this, but I think even in terms of, we were looking again at the sort of the figure work this morning, and I think 2021, there was sort of a couple of thousand of EVs, and now we're up to nearly 30,000 in a very short period of time. So I see no reason for that to continue, and the natural consequence of that is that we start to see the reduction. But James can speak more about the actual catch up of the data, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's part of the frustration here. There's a 2-year lag. Sometimes if we're measured against the report the greenhouse gas inventory that is the latest one's 2022. But in terms of, so we're projecting everything forward and having to sort of validate where we are. But I suppose in terms of that lag and where our initial projections are, it's around that 2030 where we begin to see like an increase in terms of the EV vehicles amongst our stock, and then actually the emission savings then becomes greater. And then as following on from that, from year on year, you'll see that contribution. But I think we're being very sort of transparent about that in terms of the climate action plan, which is the 5-year plan from 23 to 27, but also in terms of the 2030 target. In terms of we're not saying that, in terms of we're going to do X and there's no credibility behind it. What we're actually saying is that in relation to, we will be a slow burn here, in relation to some of this, but in terms of the greater benefit will come that post 2030, where in relation to you'll see a sort of a significant decrease in terms of the emissions and that contribution towards the net zero at post 2030.
And then I suppose how much of the electric vehicle task force is helping complement some of that and feeding in and informing some of that information as well as part of that? Have they been sort of ramped up as well as part of this, and how often are they meeting?
In terms of the EV infrastructure task force, I think it's fair to say that it's been instrumental in terms of the charging, in terms of the ESB charge points, that has seen the significant expansion from where we were of the charge points. Again, the recent figures show that, as well as, I think it's, the exact figures, but even when you look at the pipeline coming through planning, and the sports grants things, you can see that there's significant expansion coming in addition to the expansion that's already happened. In terms of the task force itself, we've been looking at, really, it was set up at a time to look at sort of those kind of pump priming actions. I think what we're seeing now is much more business as usual approach, where we engage with them all the time. So the actual sort of task force itself and as a structure, is probably needs to be sort of looked at in terms of, and betting it more just always engaging with stakeholders. It's a good thing to do. We don't need a task force to do it. But hey, David can speak more.
Yeah, Chair, I can update you on what we've been doing as far as the task force is concerned. So the task force was originally put in place as a delivery mechanism for the energy strategy outputs, which was obviously a DFE strategy. But one of the original actions was the move to charging, was the thing that really kicked off the charging for electricity at charge points, kicked off the charge point market. And now we've got 20 charge point operators operating within Northern Ireland on a commercial basis, and they are, we've now got 670 charge points on the public charge point network. We can see the opportunity for about another 500 coming in. Obviously, you would be aware of the on-street residential charge point programme that's going on up through Strabane, leading the consortium there. We've got a number of other applications from charge point operators to put in charge points, and then we've got a further number of charge points that are coming in through the Shared Island Initiative Sports Ground initiative that Shan was talking about. So there's about another 500 probably coming online in the next while. So what we saw was that because that market was changing and evolving, we were talking to the people who were on the task force on a regular basis. They were feeding in information to us. So we wrote to them recently, and we're meeting on Friday the 6th. And our intention is that we will move to a more direct stakeholder engagement approach, rather than having a task force that met just to talk about the wider issues that were out there, so that we can identify those. So we had an oversight group, which includes the statutory bodies like NIE and the utility regulator, and so we've got that group that we're going to hold together, and then we're going to move to direct stakeholder engagement with all our other colleagues like the Consumer Council, VANE, and meet with them to discuss how, and charge point operators, how the market is actually where it has got to, how we can deal with those individual issues. We had also an issue over that because the the number of charge point operators had increased. We had a situation where we had CPOs sitting on a task force who were discussing policy, but we had other people in the commercial market outside that who weren't part of that conversation. So in order to be able to bring them in, we felt that this was a best approach. Now, the response to that from the task force members has been positive, and we'll be talking to them on Friday week.
That's positive to hear, and it's positive, that it'll mean it's I suppose, I'm not saying more open, but open in the sense that, stakeholders that maybe do have concerns, or even looking at that urban versus rural, which is an issue in terms of, I suppose, getting investors to invest in, and I hate this term, but harder to reach areas is important as well. So that's positive. I'm going to move to other members now. Keith.
Okay, thanks, Chair. I just want to go back to your little graph, James, on page 13. Explain that to me, the white line, understand the white line, obviously, and understand the slump during COVID, okay? So, if all the cars during COVID had stopped, okay, 100%, where would that white line have dropped to?
Well, I suppose in terms of that, it's not my data. Remember, in relation to that white line relates to the greenhouse gas inventory. So in terms of that's what's been reported in relation to the emission savings over time. So in terms of that's not what we're forecasting. That's just actually the historic data in relation to.
Is that a Northern Ireland graph?
No, that is a Northern Ireland graph. Yes.
So, but if you were maybe guesstimate's not the best word, but if you were guesstimating that all the cars stopped, where would that white line go to?
Well, in relation to unless we have the data, but in that white line, predominantly journeys had stopped. No, in terms of or reduced in that during that time.
For the sake of argument, let's say there was 10% of cars on the road. For the sake of argument, so we'll go down a little bit more, right? I can understand that graph then, because if you go back to the previous page, it says cars is 63% of CO2 emissions.
Yep.
Right. So maybe I just picked this up wrong. So if it's 62%. Why would that white line not go way down to give you 40% left? So therefore, the yellow line, let's call that the Amazons, the lorries, the buses. I'm not contradicting that graph, but it doesn't make sense to me. Based on the fact, and it's not your graph, James.
No, I know.
But based on the fact of 62% is cars, that white line should be further down.
No, and I think it was a great surprise to us, in relation to when we sort of interrogating this data, and in terms of.
Was that graph nonsense?
Well, in terms of that's how we're measured in terms of the greenhouse gas.
It doesn't add up. That graph is contradicting the previous page.
Well,
and it's not your graph, so I'm not attacking.
No, I think the important thing is that we are now feeding in our data into the likes of the Climate Change Commission, because I think it does underpin some of the challenges we faced in terms of the data in the first instance. And
it just doesn't make sense. That should be showing 60% and it's showing 40 left.
And I think, as I said earlier, we were quite surprised, and James has said as well. So
I think in terms of that 60%, but in relation to that 60% is in relation to when all the traffic is on the roads. In terms of that 60% of all the movements are on the road, we take that off. No, in terms of that 18%, and maybe as we're being ramped, that 18% then becomes during that time during COVID will become 90%. No, kind of way, because in terms of that's the predominant travel mode on the network at that time. No, in relation to those movements. But I take your point in terms of I'm going to follow up in relation to give you some more clarity in relation to what that is.
Yeah. The graph is good to get a picture. Then another query on another graph.
Yeah.
Page 17.
It's my graph, not.
Is it
Don't worry, we've nicknamed him our forensic accountant for today. So.
No, it's just a bit. So let's.
Well, I done the graph on page 19. Flick over that.
See your graph.
Go ahead. Let's go.
So if you go to page 17, so all cars, for example, is electric by 2050. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're now in 2050, and we're charging our cars today. What percentage is required to charge all them cars? I'm not talking about charging points, I'm talking about electric, and what percentage is going to be green energy?
Well, I think that's in terms of DFE. I suppose what our role is here is in terms of this is our forecast in relation to the demand that will be required. We're feeding that information. It's that one source of data being fed to DFE. That's where in terms of we're using this data, and Sony are using that data, and NI Electrics are using this data to help inform where they need to get to.
We have an idea, if you were guesstimating figures, what it is in kilowatt hours, to charge all the cars tonight or today, and we're now in 2050. And I'm not, it's purely about, it's saying net zero. So my question is, in 2050, we're charging all our cars, theoretically.
Yeah.
And is the electric coming from net zero sources?
So I think it's really, and I probably should clarify this point in terms of the opening statement. So our role in the legislation is in relation to surface transport. So when we talk about the transport sector, it's a surface transport, so it's from the tailpipe emissions. The other sectors are sort of spread across different departments, so energy is with DFE. So when we talk about the transport sector being net zero, it's the surface transport emissions, you know, and I think that then our role, as James has said, and David will come on to, is our role is feeding in how we see surface transport being decarbonised and feeding that into other departments so that we can work together in terms of the impact of that. And we work very closely with DFE and DERA, obviously, in terms of the cap.
Well, you've chopped off the tailpipe, that's what you're telling me, in 2050, theoretically. But that is correct, your role, but technically my question is that car going to be net zero? Those vehicles, should I say? And I'm not disagreeing your point. You know, you've chopped off the tailpipe, you've done your bit. But is that electric car net zero? And is 2050, based on that, going to be net zero?
Well, I think, Keith, coming back to the point that sort of made the chair earlier on in respect of the, how we're going to move this direct stakeholder engagement. So that oversight group that was there for the task force includes NIE and the utility regulator, and you know, we're also, so we're talking to them, you know, regularly about what they're doing in order to be able to meet those requirements, how they're going to, well, through RP7, through the investment they're making in the network, how they're looking at socialisation of connection costs, all of those things that they're doing, how that will feed that opportunity, you know, and what they need to do to strengthen the grid. So that's why, you know, Keith and Chair, that's why we held that oversight group together, because we saw that there was an opportunity for the statutory organisations to talk about, this is what we need, this is where we need to get to. Can you actually meet those requirements? What are you doing? How does that all fit together? So that, again, it's a sort of evolving picture. So as they start to look at what the requirements of the grid are going to be, and what electricity is going to be available, and how they can distribute it, then that picture should come together.
I think, Keith, one of the important things is, well, like, obviously in terms of the Act, Northern Ireland collectively has to be net zero, and I think, you know, one of the things that, you know, we've probably not struggled with but has been a sort of learning curve for all of us is that, you know, departments have responsibilities. So in our case, we're quite lucky, transport clearly falls within DFI, but that doesn't mean we're having to engage with other departments, even in terms of public sector fleet, about how they decarbonise. The trick in us doing this will be how we work together across sector to make sure that when we do one thing, the consequences are understood in others. And there are many examples of those kind of needs where sectors need to work together. And in fairness to DERA, there are regular sector lead meetings, and James will meet with his data colleagues in terms of counterparts in other departments to talk about this so that it is all quantified. But I think the point, again, is that we need to be agile and work together, because this is going to need to be a very good collaborative working across the civil service for this to work. But again, at least we now have the data that we can feed in and provide reliable information. Last
final question. It was a very soft one, David. It's probably a nice soft one for you on your parting day.
I wouldn't take his word for it.
No expectation. No, it's regarding the car charging question. I think we'd asked this before. You know, in private streets, get across the pavement. I've been asked that numerous times, and I got the local response. But I just want to get sort of up to date. Where are we at with that, so that Joe Public or Mr. and Mr. Public can run a cable across? I know it's a very simple thing, but it's an issue.
Well, so you'd think.
Right, okay. So
be careful. Well, you can tell the truth now because you're going
I was expecting that you would ask us about this today, and you know, we've been here before. We've talked to you about. We've tried to keep you up to date about what we've been doing in this space. So I can sort of give you an update as to where we are. So as you know, we have been researching and developing procedures for the use of cable covers and engineered solutions to allow EV charging cables to be placed across the footway where residents don't have access to a driver or other cartilage. Now, we were doing that because it's currently an offence to run a cable across the footway, and we've been through all that before. I think at the outset it's worth me saying that the issue continues to evolve, right? And while those solutions look simple, They're not without their risks from a public safety perspective, hence the time we've taken to consider this matter. Now, I think one of the things that we've done over the last sort of 6 or 8 months is come up and listen to other people who've been coming to talk to the committee. So we've been talking to our friends in IMTAC, and you will be very familiar with some of the mobility issues that those people who are members of IMTAC have, and we've talked to them. So you find that some, even within the IMTAC membership, some people, certain mobility saying that would be great for me, and other members saying no, that wouldn't suit me. So we're looking, we had to look at what the impact was going to be on footways, what the engineered solutions were. So we've continued to try and deal with all of the insurance side of things, all the rest of it. Now, unfortunately, I'm not in a position to be able to tell you what we have. Our work is nearly complete on this, but we're not just quite there. And even at the end of last week, we had a stakeholder engagement event where we were able to talk to, manufacturers of those products, to Vanny, to some of and share with them the ideas that we have about how we might be able to put this in place. And the work's done, but we're not just quite at the point where we can bring it to committee today, but we will come back to you in the near future and let you know how we're getting on.
We will, yeah.
Yes, sorry.
But I think it's really important to highlight that point. So in solving one problem, we need to make sure that we don't create an unintended consequence for other people. And I think that is, given our role, we need to make sure that what we are doing doesn't, the legislation is there for public safety reasons, and we need to make sure that what we are doing takes account of that and it's an appropriate solution. And I take your point that it does seem simple, but and the actual physical solution might be, but we need to just make sure that the department as a whole is content around the safety implications.
That was a soft question, Keith.
I think you the answer because I've seen you reading it.
We knew it was.
I think we're also very mindful of the just transition issue here as well. So
no, that's fine. So, but from a timeline point of view, when do you see that roughly?
Look, we will. We're very aware of the need to be able to provide some clarity on this, and we can't be rushed in terms of the wider implications. And when we have an answer, we will update you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair.
No, that's fair enough. I do have a couple of people who have crept onto my list, so if you don't mind, just for time's sake, Peter first.
Thank you, Chair. And David, you mentioned there a couple of upcoming positives in terms of the charging operators. In terms of the electric vehicle task force, do you think it's been successful to date? And you mentioned direct stakeholder engagement. It's going to be shifted more into that. What will that actually look like?
Okay. I think it has been really successful, and I think one of the difficulties in trying to manage the evolving situation there has been was that we needed to keep this group together. We needed to keep them, letting us know what their issues were, what their ideas were, how we could, build that into the Northern Ireland context. But it needed to change. We needed to have an opportunity where we had those statutory organisations who have to deliver the infrastructure and everything else sitting on one side, and then listen to the CPOs, to the councils, and to the other members, CBI, the members of that group. So yes, it's delivered the original action of bringing in charging for electricity, kick-started the market here, which has been. There have been incredible developments on that side, particularly on rapid charging. You've seen big hubs like the Fastnet one that is down on the at Banbridge Outlet. So if we see the change that there's been there, so we want to keep them together. We want to make sure that they get the opportunity to have direct engagement with the department, rather than in that sort of confine where you've got different people with different ideas about what that should look. We want to hear what they actually need, and I think that's why we've taken this decision to move in that direction.
In terms of that direct stakeholder engagement, how regular, how frequent will that be?
We're going to talk to them on Friday. The oversight group, which includes utility regulator and IE and everybody else, will meet quarterly, and we will, in respect of the other, as Jan used the term business as usual, you know, if we need to talk to Vanny, or if we need to talk to you know, CBI representative thing on a fortnightly basis, we will talk to them, we will engage with them, but we will set up, for example, a Consumer Council. We would like to keep the Consumer Council have come and presented some really helpful information to the committee and to us, so we will meet with them on a regular basis. Those timescale frames will be agreed, but Peter, that's the idea, that we move to that direct discussion with them, so that we're
I think just as a department and as a team, we want to be really clear that the door's open. Like, you know, what we want to do is, you know, if you look at the task force in terms of a structure, it is useful, but probably what's actually been, you know, the reason for its success has actually been the relationship building between everybody and getting to know one another and understanding what's going on. And I think, you know, the team have done a really good job in terms of working, you know, with all the charge point operators and really building those relationships. So, you know, we'll do more of that, but we also want to make sure that, you know, where we haven't maybe engaged, people want to know from us, you know, our addresses are out there, you know, in terms of they're free to contact the team as well. So we also want to be more sort of forward thinking in terms of our comms more generally, you know, in terms of what we're doing, you know, and making sure that our message is getting out there. We've been up recently with the CBI Infrastructure Committee. You know, we're constantly engaged with the Chartered Institute of Highways and Transportation in a couple of weeks next week, just really trying to get the message out. And the more we get the message out, the more people want to engage. So, and I think, you know,
I have to
building
say,
on the work of the task force.
Coming back to the Chair's original question, do you think it's been successful? Absolutely. It has created that relationship now where, you know, we're in a position where, you know, we can, even on the data side, where James is looking for more data. We've been working with retailers and been able to get SMMT data from them. We've been able to talk to, you know, ask our colleagues, you know, in those other areas to come and talk at events that we're doing, to bring them into that broader thing. You know, talking to, you know, I was in Newry a couple of weeks ago, you know, on the logistics side of things from the freight end, to start to look at how we can build those relationships. That's been the key. And we think that the way we've set this up in respect of direct sales is not, you know, and it will enhance the arrangement that we had within the task force, and bring us up to date in respect of where we actually are in the market. So hopefully that's helpful.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And then just lastly, I noticed towards the end of the presentation, obviously today has been very focused on freight, very focused on vehicles. But active travel and bus travel got a mention in terms of policy development currently being explored. Any initial soundings on that? From my perspective, as someone quite interested in both, there's a lot of policy already there. Are we just starting, or is there a solid groundwork and a solid foundation, and we could see something rapidly happening in terms of, like, for example, what we've heard just now about the electric vehicles, but in terms of active travel and bus travel, given budgetary constraints, or do we think we're going to get somewhere else quickly?
Yeah, so I think the active travel colleagues are maybe up to brief you in the coming weeks, so I don't want to steal any of their glory in terms of you, but you'll be aware in terms of in terms of the active travel delivery plan. You know, the team has been staffed up to deliver against that. You know, and certainly it's been taken. You know, a lot of focus has been put on it in terms of within the department. It's a commitment within the Act that, you know, in terms of active travel. So it's a core component. In terms of actually, you know, the level of emission savings it makes, they're generally short journeys. They're not going to. It's not making a huge impact in terms of emission savings. Does it make a difference in terms of congestion? Yes. Bus, I think TransLink are the fourth largest fleet of zero emission vehicles in the UK and Ireland. You know, they have a programme in terms of decarbonising their fleet, subject to budget availability. We've got full metro fleets fully decarbonised. So, you know, I think there's great sort of leadership being shown in terms of TransLink, in terms of that work. So everybody's playing their part. You know, I think that the benefit, and James might want to speak a bit about this, is while we get to 20, if every vehicle was changed to zero emission, the emissions would be zero in terms of transport. Where the public transport element fits in is in terms of maybe helping more around those 2030 and 2040 targets, when the cars there's still petrol and diesel cars about, so people reducing their journeys in those and using public transport helps. I don't know if you want to say more in terms of the actual data. There's an awful lot of numbers on the screen here.
Don't worry. No, it was more for Keith because I was trying to come back to Keith in relation to your question earlier. But in relation to, I think in relation to what we're looking at is in relation to when you look at individual schemes. Say for an active travel scheme, it's very difficult to understand in relation. Well, not very difficult. The actual quantification in relation to emission savings associated with that. But I suppose through the transport plans, particularly in relation to where it looks at all modes and looks across a planned area, we'll be doing. Getting a real grasp and understanding in relation to as we transform our urban towns and towns and cities, in terms of, and we will point towards that the movement of people rather than actually that movement of cars in that urban areas. What is that saving? So that that's where that policy development hook was in relation to that. We're not quite yet that year in relation to how this all looks and how it fits together, but in relation to they're all running sort of in parallel to say once we present that in relation to what it looks like in a plan, then we're able to quantify in relation to what that will do and influence people's travel and point towards that reduced trips and that mode shift. In terms of that sort of three policy strategy, that we talk about. So in relation to that, so I suppose we're certainly not forgetting about it, but in relation to we just weren't in this time be able to quantify what the overall emission benefits would be associated with that. So that's where the focus has been on that. The most impactful, which is that EV transition. Currently, but in terms of that, will have an added benefit also. In terms of the modal shift.
Okay, thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, folks, for your presentation so far. Just keen to know what work has been done or what data is available around the costs of EV vehicles. Obviously for some the costs are still prohibitive in terms of particularly upfront costs of vehicles, and I'm keen to learn a bit more about that if you have any stats on that. Obviously as technology has come on, prices have reduced and used EV vehicles now are more widespread than they were even a few years ago. So hopefully it is within your remit really, but because ultimately if we want to get people on this journey, pardon the pun, it will need to be affordable for everybody else. So I'm just keen.
Well, it's a really good question, and I think at the minute it's clearly one of the reasons why when people go to look at a car, in many cases they are more expensive. But the vehicle emissions trading scheme, and is one of the ways in which that will, is showing that the price is actually dropping. And recent, I think it was the advice from the CCC on the fourth carbon budget talks about they expect to see price parity in the coming years, which will greatly help. But I think it's also really important. Like I've never bought a new car, so that second-hand market, I think is really where we will start to see benefit. And I think David, you might want to say a bit in terms of the second-hand market and modability, but. One of the things we see as being quite useful is in terms of, I guess, the modability point, if you want to pick up on that.
Yeah, no problem. So, modability continues to be hugely important to not only the provision of electric vehicles into the market, but to the Northern Ireland car market itself. So, the fact that people are able to use that sort of high-end benefit to be able to make the choice to use it to buy a vehicle, is helpful. Modability sales accounted for about 47% of the car market in 2024. And that included nearly 8,000 EVs, 7,823 I think is the actual figure, which were battery electric, and 27% of the mobility fleet are now EVs. So that's over 14,000 vehicles. So, and they intend to be all electric by 2032. So that type of intervention, whether it's through the benefit system or how people choose to use their benefits to get, then can help the car market. Again, there's a commercial element in respect of when that price parity will be. So the number of vehicles sold, the number of vehicles that are able to be produced, the flexibilities that could be built into the trading schemes, all of that piece will help to bring us to a point where we start to get to parity. And that's where Shan, who doesn't buy a new car, will be able to get something, buy something in the second-hand market, and the second-hand market's quite strong, or you'll be able to get new vehicles.
Yeah, and so many people now, lease their cars too with, various finance arrangements and so on as well. So, just the final point, going back to a wee bit what Keith was talking about the, the charging points at homes. I know we've talked about this a number of times over the recent months as well, but do you envisage a case where every home which has an EV car, should or will have to have their own charging facility? Obviously, nobody has a petrol tank at their front door. So
we don't.
Is it just going to be the case where charging points, do you forecast them to be at a public?
I think the key here is the right mix. Mm-hmm. So where people do need to have some sort of cross pavement solution, and that there's not a barrier to them that they would have to pay for charging at commercial charge point where they're paying VAT and all the rest of them, they can't avail of those preferential rates. Well then that would be helpful. But there will be other community hubs such as at leisure centres, at sports clubs. There'll be opportunities on the strategic road network. Workplace chargers, over 1,000 workplace chargers have gone in, so people will be able to charge at work as well. So it's that mix of how you get your charge, when you actually need it, how often you need to charge, the range of vehicles increasing, the 350 battery capacity increasing, all of the technology elements will all come into the mix in respect of who needs what, where, when. And I think that is the key, that it's not there's no one fix for any of this. It'll have to fit the whole market.
Okay, thanks folks, thanks Chair.
There's some days I wish I had a diesel tank outside my home, but that's another story. Cal?
Yes, I'm not going to say anything with that, Chair. Well, thanks very much for the presentation. Just two questions. I mean, and it's going to be a slightly difficult one, David, for yourself. In terms of where we're at, and we're 25 years or so to go, where's the general populace on it? I know it's difficult. You've been dealing with the EVs and stakeholders and everything else, but clearly to change the public's attitude towards things, a modal shift. I mean, have we any indication at this moment? I know it's a difficult one, but have we any indication, because we're going to bring in legislation in line with the carrot and stick approach, or with this, that, done, but to generally incentivise people and get that real change? Have we any early indications where we're at, or anything come from the industries or stakeholders out there?
I think the first thing that I would say about that is that Shan mentioned it right in her opening comments about just...
I might have missed that.
No, it wasn't. It was just generally, I think maybe later on, but about our general communications, how we communicate the message. So what messages are out there? So what misinformation is out there? We read, and I'm not going to start talking about all the individual things. We read in the papers about what people think of electric cars, what they think of batteries, where they get them from, all of the things that go along with what makes people think, oh, that's not for me. So I think one of the things we've been working with DFT and with our stakeholder partners is how we can change that messaging, what we can do as a department to be able to assist that, how we can get that information across. So is the general populace, are they sold on electric vehicles yet? We'll just have to wait and see how we can see that market. Certainly, it's encouraging. The commercial operators are investing in public charge. People are buying cars. Motability are putting them out into the system. People enjoy driving them. They like them. We now just need to keep that momentum going and making sure that as a department we can play our part in helping that happen.
I'll take that answer for now. We've a long run in, but we have an opportunity, you know what I mean, to be fair.
I think, Cal, the key point that I've mentioned before is this is a decades-long journey.
No, 100%.
And I think, as people get more used to seeing cars, as their mate gets one, and they, a lot of these things are nervousness about change, and it's entirely understandable, because in some cases now it wouldn't work for people. But I think when they come to look to sell their car, maybe not this time but maybe the next time, that these become 100%, more
Sean, but I'm more thinking about encouraging the people, because that's grand. Any other, even the derogation of Europe wasn't as long running. All I'm saying to you, it's going to be mindsets and changing people's attitudes and that. But James, you want to come in?
No, it was just on a point in relation to that attitude, towards that decarbonisation. We sort of presented, was it last week or 2 weeks ago, in relation to the transport strategy, and I suppose part of that transport strategy and the comms, in relation to within the transport strategy itself, in terms of there had been a research paper done by Consumer Council in relation to attitudes towards decarbonisation, the percentages of would they move to certain mode. And through the transport strategy communications, what we're going to try and do is drill down in relation to pull some of those percentages out and sort of challenge in terms of encourage the comms to understand why in terms of it's only 68% in relation to would switch to EV vehicles. So I suppose some of that intel and some of that information in terms of we can draw out of some of these these upcoming consultations to try and gauge in relation to where we are, and maybe we're missing something in relation to what we need to bring forward to further incentivise or educate kind of way. So I think that'll be an important exercise that will be upcoming now in the next month or so, kind of way to help that.
And James, specifically for yourself, because I enjoyed the conversation you had with Keith there, and it says net.
On my graph, I hope this is on my graph.
No, I'll come to the graph in a minute. Just the net zero should occur in 2050. So just in case I'm not around personally, I want you to send it through a Stargate to all those charts or something, or use a TARDIS or something. Just give me that information. I'm quite interested. But my point is, because Keith raised a very valid point, it's about the data and getting proper data, and that's and I know he's challenging a individual chart. Thank God we all got O-level maths. We're not doing too bad, but I understand his point in that.
Yeah,
but
100%.
We've often had conversations about the proper data, and we need to. And obviously, it's cross-departmental and other stakeholders. There's other departments out there in universities. We need to get that.
Particularly in relation to what we found, particularly in speaking with other nations, in relation to where we are and what we're doing. We've been able to take advantage of our size and in relation to our data, and being able to take a wealth of data, and that's where we are in position. And others are looking out the south are looking in relation to how they can actually come along and actually use that. Also Wales and Scotland in relation to are looking at that in relation to how they can follow suit in relation to what. So I suppose we're leading the way, but we're not finished yet either. Kind of way. I think we want to remain best in class, but it's going to rely on that data and that sort of machine learning, understanding in relation to keep gathering and investing and understanding in relation to what are those insights, what are those outcomes, what is effective, what's not effective. So, and then sharing that, and then also using that data to sort of bring people along with us as well.
Well, just on that data point as well, we were talking before about this direct stakeholder engagement. So we're getting data from other sources. We're getting it from the retailers. Consumer Council, we're up talking to you about the recent survey that they carried out. Vanny have provided us with very helpful information. So all of that is now starting to feed back in again, and we can use that data as well to try and frame some of our communication side of things.
Well, absolutely, getting the general populace with 100%. That's part. Chair, thanks very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, Active Travel, they are up on the 11th of June to the committee, so we'll be discussing some of that aspect of things as well with them. So, look, thank you very much for your time at committee. David, we do genuinely wish you well. Thank you for everything in terms of infrastructure and infrastructure committee. I know that you will be absolutely devastated that you won't, and I know that you will tune in and listen to it. But look, thank you very much for your time. We really do appreciate it. Thank you. All the best. Bye. Okay, members, I just want to check, is there anything that anybody wants to check up just in relation to that? We do have obviously more evidence sessions in relation to it, so I think there will probably be an ongoing discussion just in relation to that as well. Happy enough? Yep. Okay, I'm going to move on quickly then. So item 9 is subordinate legislation. SR is not subject to Assembly proceedings. So there are 3 statutory rules that are not subject to Assembly proceedings, so they're not required to be laid. And these are at pages 145 to 155 of your meeting pack. And they are the SR 2025-87, the road speed limit, number 2, Order Northern Ireland 2025, the SR 2025-88, the loading bays on roads amendment, number 2, Order Northern Ireland 2025, and the SR 2025-89, the parking and waiting restrictions Belfast amendment, number 2, Order Northern Ireland 2025. So are members content to note the statutory rules? Content, okay. Thank you. Item 10 is subordinate legislation, SL SL1 not subject to assembly procedure, so there are 3 of these, and they're not subject to assembly proceedings and they're not required to be laid. These are pages 157 to 165. So they are the SL1, the parking places, disabled persons, vehicles, amendment number 3, Order Northern Ireland 2025, the SL1, the parking and waiting restrictions, Belfast, Order Northern Ireland 2025, and the SL1, the waiting restrictions, Castle Rock, Order Northern Ireland 2025. So does any member of any, or not interest, but does any member of any issue that they want to raise on them? No? Content?
Yep.
Okay, so members, you're content with the proposals for the statutory rules? Content?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Item 11 is our forward work programme. At page 167, you'll see the draft forward work programme. So just remind everybody that our meeting is at the Belfast Harbour Commissioner's office next week. Please, if you haven't done so already, you need to confirm with the clerk in terms of your attendance at next week's committee meeting, your intention to stay for lunch, and your intention of the boat trip at Belfast Harbour Belfast Harbour. Can I just remind you, obviously we are outside on a visit next week, so just remember about your laptops and your phones. Get them charged up before we go, because obviously being on an outside visit, that might make it a wee bit more difficult. So if you could do that just to assist with everything, and your packs, download them and things. I don't need to teach suck eggs, but it'll just make it a wee bit easier whenever we're out and about next week. So if you could please do that within the next day to the clerks, just to make them aware, it'll help for planning. Okay.
Come on, Johnny, plan B, but I always go to plan B. That's okay, we're sorted.
Happy enough?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and you're happy to proceed with the evidence sessions as set out in the draft forward work programme to reflect any decisions taken today? You're happy? Yeah. Okay, so any other business? Anybody have any other items of business that they want to raise at this moment in time? No? Okay. So, as I said, the date, time and location of the next meeting will be next Wednesday, 28th of May, in the Moorland Room of Belfast Harbour Commissioner's Office, which is 2 Corporation Street, Belfast, at 10 a.m. Thank you. I now adjourn the meeting.
Committee Room 29. Sound. 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 Committee Room 29. Sound.